Welcome everybody to another episode of Imperial 80s. Mtume, how are you doing today?
I'm all right. As happy as I can, or happy as good as I can be on a Monday. Making that happen. But good. But happy to be here. That's kind of what I meant to say.
Yeah, I'm happy to be here too, so we could talk about. This is up there with like the worst movies that we've watched so far.
Yeah, I mean this is Three Amigos territory for different. Well, no, maybe somewhat similar reasons, but different
yeah,
reasons in terms of genre. But it's right there. It's right there.
that's what we should do today. Is like Empire of the Sun or Three Amigos, a comparative analysis. Because you're right. There's actually there's a lot of overlap between these two
Mm-hmm.
films.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah. Anyway, I'm excited about our selection of a guest today. I thought it was a good selection when we chose Charles, but I think that given the context of this movie, it's actually really important to have somebody who, is grounded in, Chinese history. And so I'm excited about that and has a specific political orientation to all of that too. So for folks who don't know, Charles is a member of the Qiao Collective, and I will say in advance, I do not do tonal languages. I'm a fairly monotone person as it is, and so he's going to correct my pronunciation on that. But that collective is an anti-imperialist, diasporic Chinese media collective that formed in 2020 to combat imperialist propaganda, the propaganda war on China, and uphold the legacy of Chinese internationalism and socialist construction. I imagine people are familiar with their work. The website, if I didn't put it in the show description, I think I did, but I will make sure that it's in there. But, very important because I think that there's so much anti-Chinese propaganda in our media and from our political class in this country. It is kind of the number one target of U.S. imperialism at this point in terms of trying to, um, seeing it, I guess, as the greatest threat, right, to U.S. hegemony, which they're probably right about actually, but not necessarily in the kind of, you know, uh deformed ways that they talk about it, right? And the kind of demonizing and all the things that they do to make everyday Americans feel like they have to be afraid of some kind of, Chinese threat or Chinese influence or Chinese technology or all of that.
Yeah, and I'll add, there's also, I mean, a multi-frontal, and I know Charles will talk about this. It's not just sometimes we can expect this from the rather right wing and liberal, but there's also even from the left, and I think a misunderstanding of the history of how this film would come about could also become fodder for kind of anti-Marxist, Western Marxist fodder against, that's really just anti-Chinese rhetoric that we see heavily. But really, the people to be anti about with this movie are definitely not the Chinese. It's the imperialists who made it.
Oh, it's such a bad movie. All right, Charles, we're going to bring you to the stage. Please talk a little bit more about the work that you're involved in and yeah, just a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much, Jay. Great to be on the show with both you and Tumi. You know, longtime listener, first time guest. Yeah, so Qiao Collective, as you mentioned, we did form in 2020, primarily coming out of the early COVID pandemic and the spike in xenophobic propaganda, sort of wall to wall, in various manifestations across like media of all different purported tendencies that we saw then. But it's also important, and this gets to your point to me that our formation in 2020 was also largely in response to and as an intervention in the discourse, specifically on the self-described broad left in the West and the U.S. in particular, coming hot off the heels of the Hong Kong protests of 2019, right? Where, you know, the exercise of, you know, some measure, not even the full measure of like Chinese sovereignty over its own territory that had been, you know, colonized by Britain for 150 years, right? Really since the start of the century of humiliation and the first Opium War, became this flashpoint, you know, where suddenly that was portrayed as like an act of Chinese expansionism or imperialism even, right? Neo-colonialism, in a way that like completely, you know, obviated and distorted the history there, right? And of course, British colonialism in China, you know, on sovereign Chinese territory is like a major structuring theme of this film. You know, not in Hong Kong specifically, though Hong Kong does get brought up, but actually in my family's hometown of Shanghai, right? So for me, there's that sort of like direct personal connection as well, you know, with the place that my family's from, and the fact that like, you know, when this film Empire of the Sun was filmed on location in Shanghai in 1987, was like, you know, this political conjuncture that in many ways was formative for my parents as well, right? For their you know, eventual decision to emigrate to the U.S. And the whole sort of like ideological environment surrounding, you know, the relationship between the Chinese diaspora in the U.S. and China, right? That really colored and structured a lot of my upbringing, and you know, it made it so that I had to go through quite a journey of my own, really, to arrive at these anti-imperialist politics, to reevaluate everything I had been taught to believe about China growing up. You know, not just within my family, but you know, again, from like all arms of the ideological state apparatus, right? So yeah, it was a very interesting experience for me to watch this film, in my case, for the first time. And I guess the last thing I want to mention is that, you know, it is set physically in China, right? Specifically in Shanghai and Suzhou, during World War II, during the Second Sino-Japanese War, which you know, in China is referred to as the War of Resistance against Japan. And we, of course, marked the 80th anniversary of the conclusion of that war, right? Of victory over Japan, not too long ago. I think about 2 months ago to the date, right? September 3rd of this year. And there was a lot of discourse at the time about, you know, this big military parade in Beijing that you know, commemorated that event, the geopolitics surrounding it, the aesthetics of it. And there was a whole other wave of bad discourse around that, right? And the memory culture surrounding World War II in China versus the West, respectively, that we felt was important to respond to as well. So if you go to qiaocollective.com, that's Qiao spelled Qiao, then the sort of top article, the most recent publication, at least on our website, right, is specifically about that. And so I would highly encourage everyone interested to check that out as well, because some of what I'm going to be talking about, you know, during this episode is going to be drawing on that.
Awesome. Thank you. Definitely encourage people to check that out. There's some great comments in the chat already that bring up in a second. Actually, I'll just bring them up and then we'll talk through some of this stuff as we go along. But somebody said, I walked out of a Tom Shoppard play once because it was so fucking boring. Oh my God, the screenplay is by Tom Shoppard. What the fuck? Based on a J.G. Ballard novel. What the hell is this movie? This is White Man Madness. And I don't know if I've seen this movie yet. I will say this from the jump. We do thumbs down. Like, we do not recommend this movie if you have not subjected yourself to this movie. There's really no reason to do so. We will tell you everything that you need to know about this movie. I'll say, like, just starting on kind of like our origin stories with this film. I think Mtume saw it more times than I did based on our text exchanges, but it was very heavily played on like, again, like kind of the HBO, the secondary sort of market, these cable movie services that we watched as kids, that would just be on. So it was something that was on. I had forgotten until I went back that Christian Bale, that it's like his, his first film, which, is really interesting because I'm like, has he actually spent his entire career playing fascists? Like maybe that, like since he was like a little kid, he was started playing fascists and he just kept going. But but anyway, it's also, I mean, obviously it's a Steven Spielberg film. And again, it's not the first one we've done. We did Raiders of the Lost Ark. We talked about all the racism and imperialism within that film, the Orientalism within that film. We also did Poltergeist, which, there are debates on what his role is, but he's involved for sure, at least as a producer and as a involved in the story to some level. And he may be much more involved than that. He seems like he was at least on the set a lot. And this also has a very Spielberg feel to it. There's like these moments like when he's like the scenes with the Christian Bale's character like throwing these fake planes and it going around and kind of the magical stuff. Like Spielberg loves these little like, it's very weird. I can't wait to hear M2May talk about it, but like it has this kind of weird Spielbergian quality where it's like it's real life, but it has a little bit of a magical thing going on, a little bit of a childhood kind of thing going on. It's kind of Disneyfied in a certain way. And so I watched it as a kid. I definitely saw it. I saw it probably a couple of times. It didn't make a big impression on me. I didn't find it very interesting. It was like kind of a thing that we might have on in the background while we were playing video games or whatever and not pay a whole lot of attention to. And I didn't go back to it. Like it's not one of the things I think is interesting is where it sits within Spielberg's like kind of career, right? So the shift from like the Jaws Spielberg to like Raiders and the Indiana Jones stuff, and then E.T., but like it's really him shifting into these kind of epics that he would get into of doing these really long movies. There's really three big ones about World War II this one, obviously Schindler's List and Saving Private Ryan. And it's all of those films are pernicious in certain ways for sure, but this one I think is also, he hasn't gotten quite to the point where he's perfected what he wants to do in terms of that, right? So it's like it's also not, those films are better films even if I don't like what they're doing, if that makes sense, right? Like I might think those films are worse in a certain way because ideologically they're more sophisticated and there's a better, because the story is a little bit better and the movement within the film is a little bit better, like it draws more people in, so it has more of a potential to do harm in some ways. But this film is quite nefarious, I think, in a number of ways, which we will get into. But I don't want to jump too far into that. So, M2May, tell us about your childhood stories with this.
So this was a movie that was on in my house quite a lot. It was funny rewatching it because I hadn't seen it since I was a preteen, maybe like 11, right? And I was 7 when it came out, but it was on a lot, and I was remembering scenes like the big plot points. They all flash back at me, even some of the emotions that would come in a kind of like memory recall of like how I would have attached to it as a kid, which kind of shows you how psychically bad these films are. Because if I was like less sophisticated analytically, I could totally like get wrapped up in it totally. Even though thinking the film is horrible, like I could watch I was totally in this time watching it, like not enjoying myself, but then literally could access an emotional recall, right? Especially at the end, right? When he sees his parents again, right? And I think that was the reason why, as a kid, I was into the movie, probably into some of my own stuff with my own family and parents, and you know, abandonment, you know, growing up in a home of divorced parents. I'm sure it was tapping into that kind of thing. So I would watch it a lot. It would come on a lot. And then I never wanted to watch it again when I got a little older, because once I became a teen, I began to hate Steven Spielberg. When I got really into film, and I remember when I think I saw, even before not Schindler's List, Saving Private Ryan, and I'm right, I hated that movie so much. It's even before I had really good politics. I just hated it. I just couldn't stand it. Right. When I thought about Empire of the Sun, I was like, well, I know I liked that as a kid, but I don't really want to go back. An interesting thing about Empire of the Sun, to your point, Jay, though, there is a cult around this film that sees this as, you know, one of Spielberg's high art pieces, right? And it kind of lives in this kind of evidence that Spielberg had the potential that he would later in the 90s solidify as not just being this hack Hollywood director, but a high artist, right? So even where, you know, maybe this film could even be flawed in some of its execution or overly, you know, presentational and just too melodramatic, there's a high art kind of underbelly in Spielberg that's awakening, that gets really unleashed with Schindler's List. Schindler's List is the film that then they go, oh, Spielberg, you know, has found his, you know, his high art, you know, maximum, right? This is all bullshit. I don't agree with any of this, if anyone knows. If backtracking, watching this film, you get the greatest evidence of Spielberg's absolutely awful and just complete degraded way of doing period. It's like an expressionism that's plastic. It's a plastic expressionism, right? Because expressionism is not supposed to have like a heart to it. It has like like an energy, and he expresses like kind of highly, but it's like totally devoid of any real emotion. And we'll get into the writers, because I think they are super important in this. But I think it also shows Spielberg's weird reverence for the people that he considers to be his enemies. And I think when we know that with the Nazis in the Indiana Jones films, and even how he aestheticizes Ray Fiennes' character when he's shooting the Jews in the concentration camp in Schindler's List. I've never liked that scene. I thought that scene is disgusting, right? You see a similar thing here with how he presents and his kind of emotional relationship with the Japanese. And it's solidified in Ballard's comments, I think, also about the Japanese as well. But yeah, that's kind of where I was with it over the years, with a lot to jump into. And there's things that I'm really curious, and I can't wait for Charles to jump in about the creation of this movie that they're trying to kind of unpack. But I think is very, very, very informative.
Yeah, why don't you go next, Charles? I know you didn't see this as a kid, but like maybe you can just sort of start with like your first impressions at a high level as well, or anything you want to kind of dig in to open us up with that.
Yeah, for sure. I may not have seen this as a kid, but the other two entries in this kind of like loose, informal, I suppose, World War II trilogy of Spielberg's, right? Schindler's List and Saving Private Ryan, like, were a part of my childhood. And I think in some ways, for my family as well, that was almost like a requisite, or like a stepping stone into acculturation, right? Or like assimilation into like a conventional Western sort of like historical understanding, right, of World War II in Europe, right, which of course in the like predominant mental image of World War II in general, right, like takes an outsized role in the US. Both the sort of like instrumentalization of memory culture around the Holocaust as seen in Schindler's List, right? the like total absence of any recognition until I think like briefly at the very end, right, of who liberated the concentration camps, namely the Red Army, and not the U.S., right, as many Americans seem to believe. The mythologization of the D-Day landings as supposedly the turning point of that war, right? And so I guess for me it was interesting to see some of the same tendencies, but in like a transposed way, right, at play in this earlier film, that concerns World War II, the sort of Asia Pacific theater of World War II. Because what is especially striking about Empire of the Sun, I think, is like even in comparison with the other two films, the treatment of like China itself as merely like a geographical locus for the inter-imperialist dimension of the Asia Pacific theater of World War II, namely between the Empire of Japan on the one side and the US and Britain principally on the other, right? In terms of like named characters with any kind of significant speaking roles whatsoever, right? And especially in terms of characters who are portrayed as in any way like actually mounting a meaningful resistance, armed or otherwise, to Japanese occupation. There is almost a complete absence of Chinese people, of like the Chinese nation as any kind of coherent like political unit, right, that is waging a war of liberation and national unification. And like at most, it's reduced to like a few sort of servants in the main character's like very privileged British household in the international settlement, the sort of joint US-British concession in Shanghai. A couple scenes of like teeming hordes of faceless Chinese masses, right, who are just like fleeing from place to place. And again, in terms of like actual resistance to Japan, right, maybe like one scene of like a couple seconds at most, right, of like a few guerrillas like sniping at Japanese troops from like a rooftop where we don't even see their faces, right? They're on screen for a couple seconds tops, and if anything, that act of resistance, which is portrayed as like very isolated, right, not really the result of necessarily like any kind of like command structure or like larger like military strategy or anything. It's portrayed in kind of a threatening way because the main character Jim is actually down there on the street as well and manages to get himself like momentarily trapped behind enemy lines, right? So I found that to be quite striking. And then this is before even getting into the deeply like embedded affective attachment that the main character, played by a very young Christian Bale, feels for Japan, right? Like right from the jump in the opening scene, basically in a conversation with his dad, right, where the dad says, the war between China and Japan, despite the fact that they're literally in China, is not our war, and then like kind of idly prognosticating about the course of it. Jim saying that like, not just that he thinks Japan will win, but that in a way that he hopes Japan will win because they have better planes, right? So this like real kind of like techno fetishism as well that is like a strong current, where really he has this almost sensual like attraction to the engineering prowess, right, of Japanese warplanes. He's obsessed with them. He has a toy Japanese warplane that he's like super attached to, and really like he doesn't start to abandon this until he sees like actually superior like industrial capacity in the form of US warplanes, right? And then, so he goes from like trying quite overtly to surrender to Japanese troops, towards the beginning of the film, to surrendering to US troops at the end, in like a very like on the nose depiction of the transfer of the imperial hegemony, right, in the region from Japan to the US at the conclusion of the war. But in a way that's also not actually like questioned, right? Again, there is this lacuna around, China itself as the setting. But, intentionally or not, I think like this film for me was one of the like clearest instantiations of a tweet by my good comrade Joo-hyun Park of Norudol, a Korean, anti-imperialist org, whose summit Mtume and I actually met at personally briefly earlier in the summer. But anyway, this tweet by Joo-hyun Park of Norudol, which lives rent-free in my head and which I think about like all the time. It simply says, Britain, or as I like to call it, white Japan. And that for me was just like a running through line of the entire film, right?
Awesome. Thank you. Mtume, do you want to do some of the Hollywood,
we could do some of that, because then I would love Charles to help me with some stuff actually at some point, because my biggest questions have to do with the period of the co-production. I can make assumptions and maybe I will throw out a few and you can tell me if I'm wrong or certain things like that. Now, the film, we said, was directed by Spielberg. This is, a kind of up ladder in like Spielberg. This is like 87. So his career has definitely kind of hit like a rising, he's already one of the Hollywood's most prominent directors at this point and revered on multiple levels. He's not quite an artist though. And there is those kind of questions about, and I talked about his like artistic prowess. So I could see this for his kind of own like ego and consciousness, him wanting to attempt something like this. He was not the original director. The original director was a guy named Harold Becker, who the movie people might most recognize as Taps, which is a movie we should actually probably do. I have actually for Imperial 80s. But Becker wasn't able to do the film, and the next person they went to was David Lean. David Lean, if people know movies, is one of the big British epic filmmakers. Bridge on the River Kwai is one of his most famous films. Very heavy-handed Western culture garbage. I don't like Lean movies, but we can get into that another day. Lean had to drop out for various reasons, so Spielberg came in. Part of the reason why Spielberg wanted to come in is because the way the film was being constructed, Spielberg was attracted to, because he said Lean was one of his inspirations growing up. Like Bridge of the River Kwai to him was like a huge thing. Which is a side note about these 70s directors, these late 60s, 70s directors. Even the ones who considered to be more radical, they have this reverence for these, I'm going to say imperialists, or these heavy-handed, large, epic people. Like, it always like, when Scorsese wants to be like some kind of like rebel, but then he'll talk about how much he loves John Ford. I'm always kind of like, yeah, this is where I see your bullshit, in your movie making, right? But so Spielberg has this reference, so he's decided that he will jump in. So the film is based on a novel, actually a memoir, by a guy. Well, no, it's the novelization of the memoir. It's so weird. It's like a three like pronged thing, right?
Yeah, it's fictionalized, but it's based upon his own life experiences.
And he had a memoir that he also wrote as well. So by a guy named J.G. Ballard, who is a much more well known for sci-fi. Sci-fi is like really where his kind of understanding and known, and it's based semi on kind of his experiences, and we can talk a little bit about that in some time. I know there were some questions in the chat about the differences. I have not read the book personally. I know some about the differences. I'd be curious if people could throw those in the chat if they know them. I'd be really interested to see The other, I think, really important person to bring in is someone that's already been mentioned in the chat, and that's Tom Stoppard. And Tom Stoppard wrote the screenplay. Stoppard is a huge figure in the American theater. I mean, in the Western theater. I say American because I actually learned about him. He's also a huge figure in the American theater, but in the kind of Western theater. Stoppard is significant because after like 60s and 70s radicalism in the theater, Stoppard brought this kind of like conservative bent. He kind of brings back this like fake intellectualism. Plays like Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are dead. Existentialism. So when the 60s and the 70s and even like 30s and 40s plays were dominated by things like Marxism and various other, even post-left ideologies, Stoppard comes back with a more kind of pro-Western enlightenment kind of values, playing with existentialism and these kinds of thoughts. And I mean, he's also a self-admitted conservative. He said it. I'm a political and social conservative. He was a Thatcherite. He voted for Thatcher. And another thing to think about Stoppard is he's actually not British by born. He's actually Czech. And then when the Nazis came in, his family moved to the UK, and he's very much an anti-communist, and he was part of a lot of the kind of Western anti-communist actions of the West, the authoritarianism stuff that was going through all that. He led those efforts in many ways as an artist. He's still around. There's a lot of films, a lot of stuff. He's part of the whole fabric. And when I rediscovered that he was the writer for this, I was like, oh, this totally makes fucking sense, right? And Spielberg has these relationships with these kinds of people. And like, it's I always wonder what their private conversations are like, because they have to just be so just nasty. The thing that gets interesting for me is, so the Spielberg, and I'm sure people like Lean, they have this reverence for a kind of like authenticity of period, and I put those in quotations because their authenticity is quite vulgar. So for Spielberg, it's like, well, if this movie is about World War II in China, let's go shoot in China, man. It's like they want this kind of authenticity, but it's a very vulgar visual, and even the visual is vocal. So they want the scenery to look like it. Apparently they traveled China for a year looking for places that looked like it would have done in the 1940s during the war. And this is where I would love Charles to jump in. It was done in cooperation with the Chinese government, right? And they make it at least what they say, and some kind of dealing. I have my assumptions, and I would love for Charles to jump in why this arrangement would have been made. And all my assumptions are, none of them are anti-Chinese in that kind of way, because what I do know by that time in the 80s is, the cinema framework and was so imperially dominated, right? And there is a way that people like Spielberg and so forth and so on, wanting to do these things, I can understand why a nation would be like, well, to kind of get on this world stage, there's maybe arrangements we have to make in these kinds of moments. This is kind of my assumption, and they went through like a long process of like figuring it out, using various people as background actors, or as people in the set, making, I think, as much consultation, I mean the US, as they would need. But of course, at that, I can only imagine that the actual true participatory nature that would need to happen from the studio in the US would not happen with the Chinese. They would not do that, give them that kind of grace. That's my assumption. But Charles, I want to pass it to you, because let me know if I'm wrong in any of my assumptions here, or broaden them or clarify them. I'm just very interested.
Yeah, that's like really interesting context about the I guess specific textual genesis of the film, right? Of the source material for it, um, and of course the political character, right, of the people behind that. Um, I haven't necessarily done a huge amount of like really deep digging into the circumstances of production of like the nitty gritty of the circumstances of production of this film, but you know uh what I did see from a cursory glance at the Wikipedia article, frankly, is that it was on paper at least a co-production with Shanghai Film Studios and the China Film Co-Production Corporation, and was the first U.S. Produced film to be shot in Shanghai, at least. And this may be true actually for all of mainland China since the 40s, right? Since before the founding of the People's Republic of China in 1949. Which is pretty major. And I can't without knowing more of the details myself, I can't necessarily like ascertain specifically like in what ways the overall political conjuncture of this period played into various steps of that that production process on the Chinese side. But some of the things that stuck out at me were like the use of like over 5,000 local extras, right? The shutting down of like entire blocks of like the city center of Shanghai, right? The sort of like the usage of what was then like its most sort of iconic skyline, namely the Bund, right, on the west side of the Huangpu River, where you have all of this like colonial era European style architecture that's preserved, right? That's the establishing shot of the film. And we can get into like the history of how that like literally physically came to be, right? And yeah, like what really jumped out at me was that among these extras, right, were literally some soldiers of the Chinese army, the People's Liberation Army, who were playing Japanese troops, right? I suppose because they didn't need extra, drilling and how to march in formation and stuff like that. But the politics of that are kind of wild, right? Like, especially in retrospect. So, I suppose to provide context for it, what I can do is sort of describe like the overall political conjuncture, the state of both U.S.-China relations and sort of the dominant like headwinds in Chinese domestic politics at the time, which at the very least can probably make some aspects of this make more sense, right? This was a period, the 80s as a whole, I would say, like really up until the Tiananmen protests of 1989. Which constituted maybe a decade-long like honeymoon period for the rapprochement between the U.S. and China, that followed, in particular, the normalization of ties between the two countries in 1979. Right prior to that, the U.S. Recognized the nationalist Kuomintang or KMT regime in Taiwan as the legitimate government of all of China. Of course, this was preceded by like Nixon's visit in 72 and so on, right? But 79 was when it became official. It was also about a decade or so after the conclusion of the Cultural Revolution. So by and large, like the really vocal, like anti-revisionist, anti-imperialist left, right, in China was in a period of kind of retreat and retrenchment in the wake of that. There are some analyses on the left which we don't agree with, right, that present it as a period of just wholesale like capitalist restoration and counter-revolution. I think that looking at the course of history will show that is an incomplete and ultimately incorrect analysis. But especially at the time, there like you could understand why some people felt this way, because you had within sort of elite in educated circles, in particular after like, the resumption of formal education after the Cultural Revolution, the kind of like elevation of a new intelligentsia of sorts, right? Including within the Communist Party, a pretty thoroughgoing embrace of Western-oriented liberalism. In economic policy, in sort of leaps and bounds with at this stage not yet privatization wholesale, right? But decollectivization of agriculture, right? The introduction at a pretty large scale of market mechanisms, right? And at a cultural level, really the like a turn to a developmentalist model that was modeled on expressly on catching up to the West, largely using its own methods, right? Albeit from the positionality of like a very underdeveloped, like peripheral, and for quite a long time, like semi-colonized country, right? And yeah, this was in many ways like an officially sanctioned embrace as well, right? This was actually a period of time when my mom was in the like Communist Party administrative apparatus in Shanghai, actually, and like had a pretty sort of like cushy position and a promising career path ahead of her, which changed in 1989 largely because with the events of that year, there was at least partially a reaction against the incipient potential for wholesale counter-revolution and restoration of like full-blown capitalism and Western style liberal democracy, such as we saw throughout the former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe around that time, with all the social devastation that entailed, right? But it goes to show that those very, very liberal, pro-Western, pro-US tendencies did capture like large parts of the state and party apparatus at the time, right? And Shanghai in particular like had this image, right, from in fact this prior pre-revolutionary period, right, when large swaths of it were like quite literally these foreign concessions, these like mini colonies within the city itself, of being like a very cosmopolitan and westernized city, arguably the most westernized city in the Chinese mainland. And given the confluence of sort of ideological forces that you had at the time in the 80s, you had kind of almost a positive embrace of that reputation, right, as actually like a normatively good thing, and even in some cases like a positive emphasis on the preservation of its colonial architecture, right, in the former concessions, on the Bund. The very fact that it was the site of all these foreign concessions as actually like a point of pride, right, like saying like look how open to the world we are, right, as a city, right. We were in the past kind of this entrepot, this like nexus of kind of like commercial and cultural exchange between China and the West, and we can be that again, right? That was very much the thinking at the time, and so I imagine that all of that like played into whatever role that local officials, right, may have had in deciding to move forward with this co-production, as well as the increasing like prestige attaching to Spielberg's name, right, and the desire for emulation of the West and its cultural norms extending into the sphere of cinema as well. So yeah, I guess one of like the last thing I have to say about this is that this was at a time, the underlying political economy of the US-China rapprochement was the idea, on the part of the US, that China would be incorporated into the world capitalist system as basically a gigantic hub for kind of like low value added like primary manufacturing, right? In a way that fundamentally did not pose a threat to U.S. economic hegemony. You know, and in many ways would buttress it, right, by providing like an enormous new market for U.S. produced, and U.S. designed, right, like finished products, as a huge reserve of labor, right, for the bottom rungs of the value chain. And what you had instead actually was that like the position that is occupied today by China in the you know, kind of like paranoid imaginary of you know, U.S. imperial planners, which they you know, were propagating through their various apparatuses among the population at large, was at the time occupied by Japan, right, as this like high tech industrial rival that posed a genuine and possibly existential challenge to U.S. hegemony. And I think we see that coming to the fore in this film with, you know, the fact that Jim is so obsessed, the main character, Jim, is so obsessed with Japan's aeronautical prowess, you know, with the quality of engineering of their planes. He, in fact, like directly counterposes them, you know, not just to China, not just to Britain, but to the U.S. at several points, right? And his like affective loyalty only wavers at the end, as I mentioned, when he sees like, you know, U.S. planes defeat Japanese planes in like a dogfight, and it's hard not to read that in some ways as a commentary on that moment in the 80s, which of course was a conundrum that U.S. imperialism was able to get out of, because of the fact that Japan, you know, did not actually have a sovereign industrial policy, as like, you know, a very carefully engineered, you know, like bulwark of U.S. Anti-communist imperial policy in the region. It ultimately, you know, was subject to, you know, like essentially coercion into economic self-sabotage by the U.S. with the Plaza Accords, right? Which took place just like around that same time as well, and you know, which were essentially a mechanism for the U.S. to force Japan, you know, to de-develop in some ways, right? To pursue like fiscal and monetary policies that wound up, you know, like in many ways, like negating, you know, the progress that it had made, and essentially putting it into several decades of stagnation, right? After which it could never really present even the appearance of a challenge to U.S. economic primacy again. Whereas I think a large part of the panic today, you know, from the successors of the U.S. imperial planners of the 80s is that China's in a very different position where, in fact, even though there may have been this like alliance, you know, tactical, you know, understanding of mutual interests in the 80s, underlying the initial rapprochement, China did not actually like give up its sovereignty, did not actually give up its, you know, like self-determination and its sort of technological and developmental project. And for that reason, it now actually does pose, you know, an existential threat to the continuation of U.S. hegemony, and in fact has thoroughly displaced it, you know, in the realms of not just like low value added, but you know, manufacturing in general, right? And in particular, like the cutting edge today of green energy, of, you know, communications infrastructure, like robotics. And, you know, of course, we see so much evidence of that today, such that, you know, the anxiety around that, right, the actual threat that it poses is the spur towards this like new drive to a Cold War trained on China, which really laid the political ground for the formation of Qiao as a collective.
So that's very clarifying, Charles. Thank you. Because like, one of the things I kind of want to point out, and we can get into the film, in the 60s and the 70s, the Western kind of establishment of film, the deal that they made with a kind of like anti-imperialist or these like rebel films, things like Third Cinema, was not a deal that they wanted to make as much as it was what was popular at the time. They were trying to essentially co-opt the 68 movement, be within it. When Godard is at Cannes saying, 68, 68, sorry, I'm having a big old loud thing going out there right now. But, when he's demanding all this stuff, Godard is so loved that this wasn't a deal that the establishment wanted to have. So then by the 80s, when we get into this, this very conservative turn, and we're getting into this next stage of the Cold War, nations like China are essentially left out of that. They're purposely kept out, right? Third Cinema is over, this type of thing. Tishom Gabriel talks about this in his book on Third Cinema. And there wasn't the ability to create an apparatus yet to kind of do that for filmmaking that was coming out of the countries trying to fight off imperialism. So it makes sense to me that this would happen, right? Trying to kind of figure it out, which is also interesting because then if you see by the 90s and you look at Chinese film, they really were able to then establish their own cinema again and really making really, 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 really like amazing work and developing that type of stuff. So I can see the logic totally because I was having and not to go to off topic, but I think it's informative. I was talking with a friend about Cuba, and they're having that issue right now about being able to fund cinema and having to do these kind of co-productions and what that's kind of done. Now we're in a different epoch where it's much where imperialism is really, really high at this high level where it's become tough. So these deals have to be made. So I think when people, are doing these analysis, they have to be dialectical and they have to be historical. They have to look at this stuff and say, look what was happening. Look what was not available. What's the change? You can't just go, oh, why didn't they just stay being rebels? And I'm like, this something's trying to happen here, man. They have a nation. They're trying to get the boot of imperialism off of them. This is something that is part of the process. And to me, they learned really quickly. They were like, yeah, this movie, we don't want to be doing too much of this, right? And then you got these films coming out that are just phenomenal, which I think we'll mention some at the end. Also, I think is really, really going to be really important.
Yeah, so just a couple of things just to respond to some of the stuff in the chat and like move into the discussion a little bit. So the J.G. Ballard piece is kind of interesting, and I haven't done much research into it. Dwayne brought up some good points, and also thank you for the super chat. He said, he talked about stark differences. Ballard's story at its core is about what happens when children can no longer depend on the adults in their life for protection and guidance. Jim's parents psychologically and physically collapse. So the one point that's really important to make in terms of differences is that in real life and in the book version, he does not get totally separated from his parents. There's a brief period of time where he is separated from his father, but it's like not a long period of time. And so and that's really important, I think, because like there's a whole crap load. We talked about this with How to Read Donald Duck, but there's like a whole crap load of bourgeois children's literature kind of thinking that one of the things that within Western children's literature, it's not just American, it's not just English, but it is kind of a broader Western bourgeois phenomenon, is this device of you separate children from their parents completely in stories about kids, and that the way that they justify this or argue this is that it allows kids to have greater autonomy and act more as an independent person, and that's for children something that they like to see, because usually your parents are telling you what not to do, right, all the time. And I mean, there's as we talked about in the How to Read Donald Duck conversations, which I won't go into it deep, but there's a lot of problems with that, obviously, right? Like, I mean, it's for one, like, what are you saying about parents, and what are you saying about the role of like a community kind of to, kind of educate you, hold you to account, like, all of these things, kind of what ideology are you trying to instill in people by presenting this individual who is there, like, kind of figuring things out all on their own, right? um and I think it's important to note that that wasn't something that actually happened, and it's not in the book version either, because it's just not based on reality. So that's interesting. There also is some summaries online that just say that, like, the portrayals of the internment camp in the film are much more sanitized than they are in the book. Like, there are individual scenes of like beatings and things like that, but it is not, you know, somebody referred to it as like as like a poorly run summer camp or something like that, right? Like that, like, um, you know, it's like they're bad people running this, and they're always trying to get food, but it's not like an overtly kind of violent and oppressive, like, everyday reality. Although there is some allusion to that, right? Because at the end, Jim talks about how all these people died building the runway outside the camp, but they don't really show that brutality in the film at all, right? And so that's interesting. And also, like, the death march scene at the end of the film, when they're being marched up north where there's supposedly food, and of course there isn't, right? That actually didn't happen. Like, it's not a historical thing, and it's not something that Jim wrote about in the book either. The other pieces, like the other main things, is that Spielberg brings in this kind of, as I talked about, this kind of magical, thing he does, where, like, the conversation around that atom bomb and thinking it was the soul of this woman who had died, and like all of the shit, like, that's, again, those are things that Spielberg and maybe the screenwriter added. Those are not pieces that are in the novel. And more, the novel is about, like, um as Dwayne was saying, I mean, Ballard is thought of as being somebody who talks a lot about human psychology and all of this kind of stuff. And he actually wrote the film Crash, to me, that, not the bad one, but the one that Cronenberger, or
He
what's
wrote
his
the,
name?
oh, did he write the film, or did he write what it
The
was
novel
based
it's based
on?
on, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah, David Cronenberger's. So anyway, I mean, I think he's more of an interesting person, although I will say, like, he didn't critique the film, which does say something to me about, his lack of kind of political clarity and his own sort of self-promotional nature, probably, that he was glad he sort of praised Spielberg for taking it on and never said anything, negative about it. Um, I mean, I'll just say at start, like, some of the things that are quite stark to me watching the film. I mean, and then we can kind of move into, discussing whatever we want within it. One thing that's interesting, and maybe I'd love to hear you say a little bit more about this history too, Charles, is like, I don't really remember learning much about, like, the US British settlement in Shanghai, and, like, I mean, obviously I know this is a history from colonialism and a kind of agreement and whatnot, but um that's interesting. I mean, it's interesting to have a film, as you already kind of said, that's based in China, but where there are no important Chinese characters at all. You get one person who I think is supposed to be like Kuomintang, kind of person at like a cocktail party, right? And I one of the things I was going back and forth texting with them to me sort of was like, thinking again about why would China, like, sort of approve of doing a film like this. And I think, you all have laid out, like, a lot of the kind of context that might lead into that. Another thing I felt is, like, it's also not a film where many Chinese characters are really negatively portrayed so much as they're just not in the story. Like, there is a kind of a mass of people, of Chinese people, who are clearly like repressed and poor and like, you know, that you see in those early scenes, you know, Jim negatively treats like his Chinese, you know, nanny, I guess, basically. And there's a great scene when she smacks him in the face when he comes back to the house. but the but like that's not necessarily a negative portrayal so much because it's pretty obvious that Jim is like a shitty little colonial brat, like to some degree, right? Um, and there's like so I think, you know, given the context of the time period it's showing, I mean, it's showing a period in which Japan is at war with them, right? And then there's a colonial occupation of Japan from Japan. Like I could see why communist China in the 1980s would be like, fine, like those guys are the bad guys. You know, you're gonna show that. Like we can get jobs out of this. It's not an anti-communist film, interestingly, because communists don't show up in the film at all, which I also think is an interesting choice because obviously, you know, the Chinese Communist movement is significant at this time, even if it's not, you know, running the country or anything like that. Um, and so that was kind of interesting, but it is a weird reality to watch a film that is set in China that revolves entirely around British and US figures with, you know, Japanese internment officials that are also played by Chinese actors, right? And it is a kind of bizarro world in which, you know, we're kind of it's interesting because in some ways there's a lot of overlap with Schindler's List to some degree, right? Of like, okay, you base it around these people who are interned, who are subjected to, you know, these indignities, these humiliations, you know, this kind of fascistic violence. They don't, I think, show that much of it, which is also a little bit weird and disturbing. But on the flip side, they're all European. Like there's no real, like, and nowhere does it show that Chinese people are really, you know, super repressed under the system other than they're kind of losing the war, right? As sort of the or they've easily lost it as a couple of, like you said, guerrillas like get shot or whatever, and that's really all you see in terms of resistance from Chinese folks within the film. Um and so it's a strange movie because like it revolves around white people who are themselves a product of a kind of colonial administration and relationship that are the ones who are being oppressed by fascist Japanese people, but not enough that Jim doesn't want to still like look up to them and be one of them and wear their jackets and salute them and all and sing songs to them and all this kind of stuff, which is quite it's strange. That's all I have to say at the start.
I want to say one thing that I kind of attached to what Jared said, because everything there, what struck me watching it this time was, I mean, there's two things. One, I'll say for later about the kind of Janus face of liberalism and fascism that I think we're going to have to talk about. But I think we can go there a little bit later. But the thing that I think is really interesting for me is when I look at there's the absence of the communist resistance, right? I love that you brought out that we only see their backs, and then there's like a cut shot, and then that's, you know, they're on the ground with the blood. It's just so vulgar to me. There is this image though of the poor Chinese in the edges, you know, pushing the cars and all that type of stuff, right? While you see the affluent British, but it never indicts colonialism. And what I think it always implicitly does, it does this thing where China historically is just this place of just roughness. It's that xenophobia. Like it is that thing of China. It is a historically rough place where there's poor and there's beggars and so forth and so on. And I could see a viewer, and I think movies like Farewell My Concubine also do this later in the 90s much more perniciously. But I think what ends up happening is I think for a viewer, they're going to associate with that with even the current China as well. And they're going to blame it on Chinese history and colonialism, imperialism, all this stuff will just be absent. It's like, yeah, these rich people, these rich white folk being in Shanghai isn't good. They shouldn't have those money, but they're not really the cause of the issue. Their issue is daddy didn't get out quick enough. He should have dipped 2 weeks before when he was getting the communiques, right? That's his problem, right? And you know, he doesn't know how to navigate a crowd with his kid. So he doesn't get lost, right? So it's just like it's so wet noodly to these white settler colonial assholes. And I'm like, are you serious? Right? And you're right, Jay. Like you're seeing. And this is where I think the liberalism and fascism thing, and we could talk about later, gets into it. You're seeing this large conversation about the West and Japan that I think what Charles brought up about in the 80s, and I think people who remember about is Japan going to take over the world again through the market was like the big thing. Was it the trade war, right? That was like the big phrase of the 80s. Are they going to win the trade war, right? It's like trying to resurface that and replug in on that. But to me, there's a lot implicit about that, kind of bringing up your comrades quote, or our comrades quote, right? From Noruto, right? White, you know, Japan in that kind of way. But I wanted to add that little bit in there. Charles, you could take it.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot to respond to there. I think just to like ground ourselves and I'm gonna try to like hit multiple points that y'all have raised using this as a starting point. But like the like opening intertitles of the film, I just want to like I actually like transcribe them because they were like so indicative to me, right? Oh, did we lose him to me?
He'll be back. He just stopped off for a second.
Cool. All right. Yeah, like so I'm just gonna read some of them, right? These are literally like the opening frames. Just when it's setting the scene, you know, it says to open in 1941, China and Japan had been in a state of undeclared war for 4 years. Interesting framing, right? It doesn't really indicate the aggressor, but we'll leave that aside for now. And then skipping ahead a little bit, it says, you know, and there's like a British guy who's like doing this narration in a very like ponderous way, right? He says, in Shanghai, thousands of Westerners, protected by the diplomatic security of the international settlement, continue to live as they had lived since the British came here in the 19th century and built in the image of their own country, built banking houses, hotels, offices, churches, and homes that might have been uprooted from Liverpool or Surrey. So, yeah, I mean, we have there like obviously a very real like obviation of the fact that those colonial concessions themselves were you know a product of colonial aggression, and I'm going to get more to that history later, but it is indicative of the fact that you know like what these concessions were at the micro level, right? In terms of like the built housing, the architecture, right? The control of space and so on. Really, they really were like apartheid, like mini apartheid regimes, like loggers, right? In a sense, where it you know would actually make sense historically speaking to have a story about like an aristocratic British you know boy literally born and raised there with like quite minimal direct contact with you know the millions and millions of Chinese people, like you know just not literally right next door, right, but all around, you know, and constituting still the vast majority of the civilian population there. One thing that I thought was interesting, actually, in regards to the conditions of the Japanese internment camp later, right? The Japanese administered internment camp, is that they kind of like the British and American prisoners there kind of like do the same thing, where they create this entire like mini society that essentially is like, you know, like small town, or not in a small town, but you know, like England, right, symbolically and otherwise, like transported into like weirdly into this Japanese internment camp in Suzhou, you know, complete with like tube signs, like there's a Waterloo like tube sign, right? Like Shakespeare recitals, all this stuff. They're like separate sort of British and American dorms. At the entrance of the American dorm, it literally has a sign that says like you are entering the United States, right? So it's almost like recapitulating almost more in micro, like even further in microcosm, the dynamic of that was already there within the colonial concessions. But just to sort of like set the context a little bit more comprehensively for like precisely what was up with this international settlement, how it came to be, like why it was that like Shanghai had this weird arrangement for 4 years where like Japan occupied the areas over which China was supposed to have full sovereignty, but not the British, US, and French colonial possessions. Yeah, I think it's worth like remembering that for China, what World War II, the Second Sino-Japanese War, was simply the final and bloodiest chapter of what's called the Century of Humiliation, right? This period, actually a little longer than a century, of like subjugation to foreign imperial powers, of like internal disunity, pretty much constant, like civil war, and internal fragmentation, just general like enormous declines, right, for ordinary people in standard of living, and of course all of the political ferment, the both counter-revolutionary and revolutionary tendencies that gave rise to, and that ultimately brought it to an end with the communist revolution of 1949. But the opening act of that century of humiliation, right, was the first Opium War waged by Britain against China under the Qing dynasty, which ended in 1842 in the Treaty of Nanjing, which was the first in a long series of what were called unequal treaties, basically imposed on China by like foreign imperial powers. And the conditions of this treaty, this first one, were China had to pay an indemnity for being the subject of aggression. It had to cede Hong Kong to Britain as a colony. As I mentioned, that of course would be very faithful for the political development of Hong Kong. And it was compelled to open 5 so-called treaty ports to foreign trade on like very favorable terms to Britain. Prior to the war, only Guangzhou, which at the time was known in the West as Canton, right, in the South, had this status. But of the 5 new treaty ports, the biggest one was Shanghai, right? And another provision was basically that Britain was granted extraterritorial jurisdiction over its own nationals, which meant that, if you have British people, on Chinese territory, they were not subject to Chinese law. They were subject to British law. And, obviously, it was going to apply very leniently to them, right? So those are basically the terms of that first of the unequal treaties. It was followed very quickly by another treaty, the Treaty of Wangxia in 1844, where the U.S. essentially managed to secure the same provisions for itself. And that was what created the conditions for Britain, the U.S., and France, which also concluded an unequal treaty with Qing China around the same time, to actually establish these like concessions, as they were called, in Shanghai, which were basically mini colonies, on paper sovereign territory, but really governed pretty much entirely under the respective laws of their foreign occupiers, where like everything, right, the urban planning, the actual architecture, the built environment, to say nothing of the legal regime, really was intended to serve the needs and the tastes of the respective foreign nationals, right? French, British, US, pan-European, you name it, right? That occupied the most privileged stratum of society in each concession. And this was the kind of dynamic that was encapsulated visually, for example, in the 1972 Bruce Lee film Fist of Fury, where he had that famous sign that says "No dogs or Chinese allowed," right? Which he like smashes in a pivotal moment. But yeah, I mean that pretty much encapsulated what the actual like legal regime was there, right? So 1863 was when the British and U.S. concessions merged into the international settlement. There was a separate French concession, which was like a bit to the southwest, and together these concessions occupied like most of the city center of modern day Shanghai. Like it was a large amount of territory, and it was, to use the words of Donald Trump and Jared Kushner, prime real estate, right? Included like a large chunk of the waterfront of the west bank of the Huangpu River. This is how the Bund got built. This sort of establishing shot of the skyline, with all the colonial architecture that I mentioned earlier. Yeah, like I don't know if I can easily share my screen or anything, but it's worth taking a look at the seal of.
If you drop in anything in the private chat, I can share. I don't know if you can share. But,
let me drop a link in the chat. It's worth taking a look at the seal of the international settlement. I just dropped a link in the chat, so you can pull it up. But even though the international settlement like originally came out of this sort of British US colonial condominium, it wound up actually basically providing for this like pan-colonial co-governance mechanism. And so you can see that on the flags that are represented on the seal of the international settlement. You have like Britain, France, the US, Germany, which was taken out in 1914 because of World War I, but then a ton of others as well. You got like Russia, Denmark, Italy, Spain, the Netherlands, ton of others, right? So yeah, that was just one instantiation of how like these imperial powers that in many other theaters, right, and occasionally even in the Pacific theater were at each other's throats in inter-imperialist rivalries. They established sort of like a pan-colonial like concert, right, so to speak, and like a common understanding, right, of this joint mechanism through which to administer their colonial enclaves in China, where Shanghai was really the epicenter of that. So these concessions, these enclaves, pretty much remained in place for another 80 years, right? They lasted on formally until 1943. And this meant that they survived, right, with their forms of colonial governance more or less intact through like, some of the most like epoch-defining political changes in the rest of China politically. In 1911, as a consequence of this sort of internal fragmentation and degeneration and humiliation by foreign powers, the Qing dynasty was overthrown, right? It put an end to millennia of dynastic rule in China. It led to the foundation of the Republic of China with Sun Yat-sen of the Kuomintang or the KMT, briefly as its first president, but then that degenerated very quickly into the warlord era, right? When you had, the China basically split between fiefdoms controlled by different sort of like military despots essentially, and on paper, the whichever one controlled Beijing, right, was the international representative of China, but that changed like every few years. And it was in the midst of all this, actually, that the Communist Party of China was founded in 1921. And that event actually took place in the French concession of Shanghai. That location, which is in like a Shikumen, it's kind of like fusion of like Chinese and European architecture, is now obviously like, a very well-maintained museum site in Shanghai. But, the very fact that it was founded in this area that was under basically French colonial rule, it illustrates sort of an interesting like dialectical contradiction that this weird system of partial colonial governance presented in Shanghai, which is that you had these like legal gray zones, right, that were outside the direct jurisdiction of Chinese police, and where in some ways it was safer, right, for revolutionaries to operate, at times at least, right, at the very least, by going in and out of the concessions, it was much easier to like lose the cops if they're on your trail, right? So that's something that they took a lot of advantage of. But yeah, so that was the foundation of the Communist Party, and then sort of the way that the warlord era came to an end was you had this first united front between the Communist Party and the KMT under Soviet sponsorship. They launched the so-called Northern Expedition from the southern city of Guangzhou. The intention was originally to liberate the entire country from warlordism and imperialism. But that, of course, is not how it went down, because Sun Yat-sen died. He was succeeded by Chiang Kai-shek, who was way more reactionary and anti-communist. And so this meant that when in 1927, the expedition was actually launched in 1926, but in 1927, it was about to reach Shanghai. The Communist Party led an uprising there that basically liberated the parts of Shanghai, outside of colonial control. But then when the Northern Expedition actually rolled in, Chiang Kai-shek ordered the KMT troops to purge and massacre about 10,000 communists, right? So that was a pivotal event in the history of the party. It was the collapse of the first United Front. It basically, forced them to start organizing outside of the major urban centers, and that was the nucleus for both the rise to leadership of Mao Zedong, politically, and the concretization of his strategy of like people's war rooted in rural areas, right, rural base areas. But in most of the country, the KMT was able to nominally unify territory, and establish one-party rule, right? So because Chiang Kai-shek was by this point, more or less a puppet of Western imperial powers, he'd obviously turned his back on Soviet sponsorship in 1927. This meant that even though, originally the KMT and the CPC had this common platform of ending the concession system, of abolishing the the remnants of colonial rule at a formal level, actually the concession system remained in place, right? It remained something as well that the CPC could exploit to organize underground in Shanghai even after they'd been purged. But it remained this kind of like very weird like structure of split jurisdiction, split governance, which then became very relevant again when you had a full-scale invasion by Japan, right, in 1937, because what happened was, in the main thrust of its attack outside of like the Northeast, which Japan had occupied since 1931, the strategy was to take Shanghai first, and then to take the ROC capital of Nanjing, and then basically go up the Yangtze River, right? And thereby like split the country in two, take all these major urban centers. And so Shanghai was like the first chapter in that. Japan expected it to fall in a matter of days or weeks. In fact, the Battle of Shanghai lasted 3 months. But it did end with Japan in control of all of the parts of the city that were under formal Chinese rule. But that meant that they left the concessions untouched, right? So that brings us basically to the conjuncture at the start of the film, where for 4 years, you've had the concessions in this kind of like uneasy, as this uneasy like bubble, right? That was like nominally insulated from the brutality of Japanese rule, but only because of this like inter-imperialist, like this very uneasy inter-imperialist like concordat of sorts, right? Where because Japan was not yet formally at war with Britain, the US, or France, it was not going to occupy their territory. And of course, that all came to an end with in December 1941, where, you know, in conjunction with the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japan also, you know, then attacked all of these Western colonial possessions in Asia, right? So you had the Western concessions in Shanghai, which it occupied. You had the attack on the Philippines, which were a U.S. colony, and then other British colonies as well, Hong Kong, Singapore, Malaya, you know, all of which sort of are brought up, right, in the opening scenes of the film as like these you know, holdouts of the British colonial system that they really expected to maintain a lot longer than they actually did. And yeah, as far as the concessions are concerned, those were formally abolished in 1943. They were under, you know, de facto still under Japanese occupation, but the idea was basically like, as now a formal wartime ally of China, right? It was a really bad look for the West to continue exercising, you know, this kind of extraterritorial like jurisdiction, you know, within China. It was a really bad look for them to maintain the unequal treaties, and so formally, at least, those treaties were abolished. The concessions were abolished. This was actually the same year that the Chinese Exclusion Act was repealed in the U.S., and it's for that reason, right, that like Jim and his family can't just go back to their home in Shanghai at the end. They have to be repatriated to Britain, a country which, you know, as is emphasized a number of times, Jim has actually never seen, because he's lived his entire life, you know, in, you know, this kind of like colonial like exclave, and this really, really insulated and privileged bubble in Shanghai, which is like China, but also not China. Yeah, I you know, so that's that kind of is the context for the political situation that we see at the beginning of the film.
Charles, I really appreciate you kind of laying all that out. It's a lot of history that I don't know very well, and I'm sure same for a lot of our audience. Yeah, and to me, did you have something you wanted to?
And I could already hear the film people, well, look, man, it's a movie. They can't do all that. But that's actually not the point. That's actually not the point. The point is that this movie is not interested in that history at all. And what it says is like China is a land without history, right? And this shows to show you that this is the role that these films play. I remember it's funny when the text came on when I was watching it again the other night. I was like, oh, this is what they're gonna do. They're gonna give me a text saying we're gonna give you some prehistory and about 30 seconds of text. And I said, oh, I already know this movie is bullshit. Right? Like whenever I see that stuff, I already go, this movie is BS, right? You've already kind of stepped into that, right? And then, you know, when you're watching like the first, I guess, I don't know how long the whatever you want to call it, the pre-fleeing period of his family, right? It's these like lush shots of the family, their life, you know, Jim's like reverence for these planes. The plane becomes like a huge thing for this film. And you know, I think there's a lot we could say about, you know, the kind of relationship to industrialization, you know, then the US and then Japan become this kind of like dueling industrial powers, as you know, but Jim finds this reverence for the Japanese, right? And their plane, and you're able to see it and see how kind of wowed he is by it. And Ballard had this quote that I found a little interesting that, you know, maybe in a different context means something. And he said, well, basically kids find their heroes where they can find them. And I was like, okay, that's interesting, right? But I was like, but would you go more into the depths of why that particular hero would be attractive to a settler, a kid, right? Why would he go to that one? But then clearly by the end of the film, which you have like by the big the B-51, right? Is the B-51 bombing rays, right? Is the B-51, right?
B-29s, I think, right? Isn't
B-29,
that?
the big bombing raid at the end, he then begins to emotionally connect with them, as then he also realizes that he doesn't remember what his parents look like. So this is supposed to be the loss of the innocence. As he connects with the kind of industrial thing, he realizes he's now become a man. And this is the thing about the film. The film lives in this idea of, if I create a kind of lush visual palette of long shots, filled frame of authenticity, of period, and I emotionally connect you with someone who was innocent losing their innocence, and finding how the world. Because another thing that is a really pernicious statement is their whole concept of the bomb being dropped on, because I think it's supposed to be Nagasaki, right? That he sees. It's not Hiroshima, right? It's the second bomb I believe he sees, right? So they say that this is the loss of the innocence of the world. And I hate that. And I hate that idealist shit. I can't stand it. It is so disgusting, right? Because it totally obfuscates, the imperial and capitalist history of where we are and why these things happen. It totally makes it into this kind of metaphysical thing of what, that we're living in this metaphysical age, right? And you're watching all these shots. Spielberg literally extends everything about like 10 minutes longer than it needs to be, right? The acting performances are always like fever pitched, right? At a high thing. It's funny you brought up the slap, Jay, because I know it's funny. I was like, oh yeah, slap him. Good. But the thing that always kind of kills me about that sequence also is he gets slapped not for being a settler. He gets slapped for being a little shit, right? And that to me is very key, right? He gets slapped for, because she doesn't like hate his parent. It'd be one thing if they were like secretly, if we had the scene of them like in like, their lodging area where they're like, fuck these fucking settlers, man. Like they were like plotting to do something. Go ahead.
At least they're stealing their shit though. I mean, like, like
I agree. No, I totally.
Yeah, I love the little scene of expropriation.
Yeah, when they slapped him, I was like, great. But this is where Spielberg thinks about it. He only sees his problem as being a shit, as just being a little twerp, about this type of stuff, right? Not being just the growth of a settler, right? Of a grown settler, as I mean, right? His parents were, and then he'll grow up to be maybe even worse than them, right? Because he doesn't know that anything else other than being a settler, right? And this is where where like the art of the film to me is just not good. When I watch it, I'm watching a kind of overly emphasized plastic expressionism, right? That thinks showing you period construction with massive amounts of budget, being able to kind of whip around large amounts of extras and tanks and have a big scene that really made no sense to me of him being chased by some young poor Chinese kid that was like
he keeps trying to surrender to the Japanese too, because
right?
he like fucking he loves them so much.
I surrender, right? And like I get in Spielberg's head, but to me, I watched that scene. I was like, man, I need to put this at 2x speed because this scene is pissing me off, and I don't really care, right? And you're getting all these big set pieces, and the idea that the big set piece is going to literally mean something, and it means nothing. It's utterly meaningless, other than showing imperial dominance, right? I mean, I'm watching this imperial dominance, especially when you get to the end. And I know I'm jumping around the movie because I just don't find the movie that interesting. So I think it was going to like jump around it a little bit. At the end, when he finally sees the American soldier, right? When he gives him the cup, I surrender, right? It's milk, right? That he gives him or something. Which I find
evaporated milk. Yeah,
it's in essence evaporated milk, and he drinks it. And the American soldier, drinks it. And you start with the back of his shot, but then you get his face. The liberator. It's like the reverence, right, of them. Right? It's like Spielberg is really invested in letting you know that in this fight of somewhat equally matched stature, right? Because he has a reverence for the stature of imperial Japan, right? That the Americans come on top, and you hear it with the music. John Williams, who's annoying, music of just Americans come on top, not just because they happen to win, but because there is something about them that is just at a higher level, right? There's something about them at a higher level, and the Japanese still have a kind of degradation to them, right? And you see that with the Japanese, what would I guess commander of the camp when he cries at the Welsh song. Oh my fucking God. I was like, you guys gotta be killing me. It's like you're killing me. He just like cries, and Christian Bale singing into I'm like, dude, y'all are on one. It's really awful. So like all this stuff about this being a film of high art, look, big lenses are just expensive. Being able to kind of move tons of people around is not artistically impressive inherently, right? The fact that you can do this means you have a whole lot of capital. We have to stop this with movies. It looks lush, yeah, because he had great technicians, right? But when I'm watching the film, I'm fundamentally not connected into anything, right? And I'm gonna throw in we're gonna throw in many other movies, and there's a movie that I think that they knew that it's a Russian film. And if you've never seen Come and See, it's one of the great films from Soviet Union about coming of age of a kid in war. And let me tell you, this film was highly regarded in '85 when it came out. I know Spielberg knew about this movie, right? And I know he was like, yeah, I want to do a Come and See, but like the American version. And I'm like, watch this. Go watch Come and See. Don't watch this shit. Go watch Come and See, and you'll be like, "Whoa!" That also is not a film for the faint of heart. That film is you will be ripped up inside. But yeah, I had to go on that kind of rant because the art of or the lack of is just it's atrocious, but it also shows this liberal mindset, right? And I would love to start talking about at some point the imperial Japan fascism, liberal fascism kind of duality.
Yeah, thank you, Mtumi. That was great. I mean, I kind of want to like just focus a little bit more on Jim as a character and like I think that we could just sort of say that he's representative of British imperialism in this period too, right? And I'm not saying this is like intentional. Like I believe this is probably J.G. Ballard's story more or less with some shifts in it too, right? He's born into this settlement. He's raised by parents who are a part of the like colonial apparatus there, the trade, he's in an aristocratic family. And so he probably was a little shit, you know what I mean? And maybe he became less of one over time, right? But I think that you have that, and so his interests, right, in like Japan and then eventually the US, I think makes a lot of kind of sense because he's sort of used to being in charge of everything and having everyone serve him, and so he naturally kind of looks for power or authority, right, as what you look up to. And I think that even goes to like the plane thing, right, because they show him reading some like comic book, which is like about aviation or pilots and planes and stuff like this too, as well as the toy he has, right? And I think this is like, we all grew up, well, and Toomey and I grew up, Charles, you probably did too, to some degree, is like in the US, and like these, the promotion of all of these toys. This is a huge part of what the Imperial 80s is all about to me, right? Is like G.I. Joe, it's like all of this stuff. And obviously we're going back into the 1940s here. But the reality is that there just were a little bit less sophisticated in terms of what that stuff would look like, in terms of when you get to the 80s and the 90s. And now we have, Marvel, right, as probably like the greatest representation of this in the United States at this point. But your heroes are supposed to be kind of related and connected to imperialism within empire, right? And they're also supposed to make you not really think about it as imperialism, right? But just think about it as a superhero who happens to be dressed in red, white, and blue, or have, a flag as a symbol, or, it is involved in movies with huge DoD contracts, these kinds of things. And I think that this movie is like really kind of interesting in that regard to some degree, right? Because it's like, Bale's character, Jim, is fascinated with Japan largely because he thinks that they will win, right? He thinks that they will be the new dominant force and he wants to be on their side. And he's immediately, like, very early on, constantly trying to surrender to them, to like let them know, like, I'm going to come work for you, and even like the early scene where they don't know where the concentration camp is because they don't know the geography of China, right? And he does. He's like trying to help out the Japanese soldiers to drive them to their internment camp where they're going to have to, break rocks and build this freaking runway that a bunch of them are going to die, building, right? And eventually, of course, the US, drops the atomic bombs on Japan, and Japan surrenders, and they show up, and of course they're the ones that he's going to submit to and seek to be subservient to. So it's not, to me, like, on that sort of narrative level, it's not that complicated for me. It's just a very specific choice, right? Like, you're choosing to make a film about somebody who comes from a family that had its role due to the history of British colonialism, right? And he's interested in World War II, in like who's going to be the next imperial hegemon. And for a while, for him, it clearly seems like it's going to be Japan, and kind of understandably so, given like where he is in the world. And then ultimately, it's the U.S. But it's also an interesting thing too. Like, there's this moment in it where they, he's there. The other characters are kind of helping him lose his Britishness along the way, right? And like I forget the name of Basie is the name of John Malkovich's character, right? And who's like a very shady individual, right? But he's like the guy that he kind of looks up to, and he, there's a point where he's talking about, and I can't remember who it is to. It might be to the doctor as well that he has conversations with, and he's like, "You're British," and he's like, "I've never been there," and I think that's like an important thing too in who Jim is that, he's born in this settlement. He only knows being in this like aristocratic, colonial kind of role. That's what he's looking to go back to. Like, he, even in his aspirations, it's like, hey, we'll have your friends over, we'll fill up the pool, we'll have like a party, you can come drink with my parents, kind of thing. And yeah, I mean, he wants to get back to a place where he has, servants and all of this. And I think like that, it's very hard to have that as like the center point of your film, and it to really have a critique that is anyway like anti-imperial. I think at the end, just to jump to another end scene, is that scene where he's finally like kind of, there's a Japanese like younger boy or whatever who's like trying to give him a mango, right? And like the Americans come in and shoot him. I think it's Basie actually that comes in and shoots him. And he's very upset, and they're like, I'm not going to use racial slurs in this because I don't want to, and YouTube also doesn't like it when we do, but like they call him a racial slur for a Japanese person, right? And he's like, but he was giving me a mango, like the war is over, right? And like that's liberalism, like right there, right? Like the people who just had you interned and were like, your mortal enemies, or should have been throughout this, like, now it's over, and you can share the mango between like the British, the Americans, and the Japanese, right? In this new reality. And so I think that kind of, there are some things that it's doing. Obviously, I'm not saying the film is totally uncritical of Jim's character or doesn't make him out to be like a brat, right? Or rude, and that there isn't some way you could see different hierarchies within the film. But I think there's more nefarious kind of equalization, and also just this way of just reminding people, not that they shouldn't be reminded that Japanese were fascist and interned people and did a bunch of colonial shit, but like it only resonates because it's at the expense of white people and like white children, right? As opposed to, any of the, Asian people or Chinese people, right, that they were oppressing. So yeah, that's basically my thoughts there.
Yeah, that encapsulated a lot of my like reactions to specific scenes. I guess another through line, and this goes back to the crudeness of the coming of age narrative, right? That was pointed out earlier. I forget whose comment it was, right? About this narrative device of the forced separation from his parents. There were aspects of that I thought were interesting, right? One is that like the reason why he becomes separated from them in this vast throng that's trying to escape after Japan takes over the international settlement is like he drops his toy of a Japanese warplane, and he's like in some ways more attached to that than he is to his own parents, right? And if you think of his parents as like a stand-in for, like this direct connection to the apparatus of British imperial rule and to its sort of like cultural cachet as well, right? Then there's a way that you can read his separation from them as like in that moment, right, where Britain loses control of its colonial possessions, not just in Shanghai but across Asia to Japan, as like representative of that, right? That Britain, the mighty British Empire has been humbled, by this rising Asian imperial power. It can no longer protect even its own white English subjects, right? Its white English colonial subjects in these places. And so there's like, in some sense, like a loss of innocence happening at like a mass level as well, right? But what I thought was interesting was this like transposition of it to the actual like coming of age story of this one child, where he kind of then seeks a sequence of like surrogate parental figures, right? All of which are themselves stand-ins for other imperial powers, right? Throughout this sequence, with him like kind of like fleeing from like getting chased by like a Chinese street urchin, right? Just in general, like also having to dodge the bullets of like the Chinese resistance fighters on the roof, right? To say nothing of the earlier scenes, where he's like getting driven in this like nice car through like the thronging Chinese masses on the Bund, right? With their like, slaughtered chickens and so on, like, if anything, I think he's more afraid of like the Chinese people around him than he is of the actual wartime enemy, right? Of Japan, by some measure. There's a lot more direct and affective identification with them, and in some ways I think that's connected with the need for a surrogate a parental figure, right, which stands in for this transfer of imperial hegemony. First, it certainly looks like to Japan, right, and then to the US at the end. And yeah, he maintains that kind of like relationship with like the Japanese commandant at the camp in some ways, but even more closely with Basie, right, with John Malkovich's character as a stand-in for the, you know, like really kind of like unscrupulous, like kind of American like soldier of fortune type in some ways, right? Like kind of just a hired muscle for you know, whichever like warlord or you know, temporary governing regime will you know, will pay him, right? And
I just want to say quickly, like they try to sell him, and Jim's only response is like to be upset that nobody wants to buy him. I'm like, they're literally trying to sell you into like child slavery.
Literally, yeah.
And, like,
no, yeah, it's insane. But then you know, like John Malkovich's character also becomes like a surrogate parental figure of sorts, and then there's this other like weird sort of psychosexual dimension where like when he's in the British dorm, you know, when it jumps forward to 1945, you know, he kind of has these surrogate British parents as well, right? The victors, and like there's a weird way in which, you know, he already has this like almost like eroticized relationship with like the technological prowess of Japan, right? You know, his obsession with the craft, with the aesthetics of raw power as embodied in their warplanes, as we saw earlier in the scene where he's like caressing one, right? He goes up and actually like caresses one, and then in one of several, you know, scenes where this happens, he then goes and like salutes, you know, the pilots, right?
Yo, and that
The Japanese
scene
pilots,
to me,
yeah.
that scene to me is so like ugly. I mean, because like
Yeah.
Spielberg really sits on that salute between them, and it's done it with like this backlight where you could almost like lose like the actual individuals. And I'm just like, and I'll let you go back, Charles, but I want to get to this. Like the political unconscious of this movie is very, very fucked.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. 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 So yeah, exactly. Like there's a weird way in which this is also all happening in tandem with his like kind of adolescent like sexual awakening as well, and he's like, you know, voyeuristically like, you know, spying on you know, later, right, in 1945, like spying on his British surrogate parents in a sense in the camp, like you know, having sex while, you know, like turning around and observing from a distance like US airstrikes, right, on like the Shanghai Suzhou area. So there's this raw display of, you know, now even greater, you know, like technological industrial prowess on the one hand, and he has this weird Oedipal thing going on, you know. So I found that to be like a very interesting undercurrent as well. And then yeah, that last scene where you know, instead of you know, surrendering to the Japanese as he had through like, you know, like a large chunk of the first half of the film, he surrenders to American troops, right? And I think that was a really interesting observation, you know, Jay, about like how those scenes in particular are from like a child's eye view, right? They're shot from below, like the almost like superhuman stature in his eyes of these like, you know, imperial powers that have come to replace Britain, is very much visually emphasized. But what I thought was interesting politically about that as well is you know, I actually don't think there was like a large presence of US infantry on the ground in like Shanghai or in most of China at this point, right? Like there were probably some military advisors, you know, but like coming so soon after the surrender of Japan, I mean, you know, what US troops were doing was they were doing the island hopping campaign in the Pacific, right? And they were maybe just starting to occupy the Japanese home islands, as well as, you know, the southern part of the Korean peninsula. Maybe feel their locations, but it's like very implausible for like US troops on the ground to be the ones, you know, like coming in to, I mean, not even like liberate the camp because it's already been emptied, right? But we're clearly meant to associate this with the mythology of, you know, the outsized supposedly U.S. role in liberating Europe from Nazism, in supposedly like liberating, the concentration camps, when in fact, the U.S. army maybe liberated one compared with like several dozen for the Soviet Red Army, and also with the imagery, right, redolent in Saving Private Ryan, in the mythology around D-Day. So that I think was interesting as well, because it encapsulates kind of this like really self-aggrandizing Western and particularly U.S. memory culture surrounding World War II, and that's something that we can sort of dive right into, because it touches on this other theme that I raised at the beginning about the dueling historical memories of the war, right? But yeah, I don't know if maybe before that y'all wanted to jump in.
I'm good. I think there's one. I'll make one comment too. Somebody raised the point about Spielberg being, a Zionist too, and I think like I would just say that this film is very interesting in its compatibility with Zionism as well. Just like this idea of centering again like a World War II story around Europeans, but being in another part of the world where they don't have a historical like you know there's this that like you said, Charles, like all it does is that little paragraph at the beginning of like how these people get there, and the weirdness around like building these this architecture in their own image and building a little England in China basically. I mean, you can see the kind of like I'm sort of watching that like waiting for him to really draw some irony upon this, right? Or to really kind of get Jim to like have some kind of realization of like, well, maybe the colonialism that we're involved in is kind of bad, like what these Japanese internment officers are doing to us. And there's no realizations like that take place within the film, right? So it really kind of becomes a like very much a might makes right? Or like a kind of like there isn't actually a critique of fascism within the film. Like it really isn't. Like, you know, because Jim never becomes upset at the Japanese folks who run the internment camp because of their brutality, right? Or their like kind of authoritarian, nature or whatever else, right? Limitations upon, his rights or anything like that, right? He he does miss his parents, right? He is lost. He is dealing with like growing up in an internment camp, but he doesn't represent that. And even the other characters that are there, like you don't see that like real strong critique of this is part of the problem of fascism, right? Is that all of us end up in camps, right? It's so anyway, I just would put that out there, that I think that actually there's a lot within this film that you can see as kind of like proto-Zionist, right? Or ideological currents that comport with Zionism quite well, but maybe without bringing explicit Zionism into the picture.
Yeah, and I want to throw on one thing I think is kind of like offshoot, and then we'll pass it back to Charles, because about going back to the atom bomb thing again, because of this idea of innocence and why like the innocence thing is pernicious, because doing that, you're also making like all of these colonial projects are innocent projects, right? Or they're proto-innocence, because I'm kind of like, well, look, if the atom bomb, right, is the loss of innocence, then what was colonialism? Right? Like I don't like pre-birth. Like I don't know what you're doing here. And this is the thing that liberalism does. It tries to normalize a certain kind of world history as fundamentally what it is, human, and then like the atom bomb makes us like inhuman. So all the colonialism, all these things that have happened previously that has mostly been done by Western imperial powers, right, become just fodders for, oh, well, that's just the way of the world. And you get into these kind of metaphysical conversations around humanity that really do nothing for us. I mean, and this is where like because I've been even thinking about that sequence when you see the Flash and he thinks it's his surrogate parents dying, her spirit going up. It's like it's the Benjamin aestheticization of politics, right? They go into this thing where you get the awe of the grandioseness of horror, right? So basically they make horror into this thing that we must be in awe of. And that to me is the problem of how the Western world thinks about violence and violence inflicted upon people, that you have to have this reverence for it, even if you condemn it. And that to me is just a very nasty thing, because it ends up making you reason with it to a degree, because then like, well, it's just a part of like, you know, humanity's grandioseness. I mean, there was a thing where a quote that I read where they spoke about seeing the Japanese as these powerful individuals, and he goes, yeah, they were really mean to the Chinese, I understand, but they were pretty impressive. Wow. Okay, that's your takeaway. Cool. Right?
Yeah.
One last
sorry,
quick thing.
Yeah.
Sorry. Just this is quick. So I just also want to note that, so I always bring up references to this film, but Tropic Thunder comes up here again in an interesting way. So Ben Stiller claims that he got the idea for Tropic Thunder because of his role in filming in this, because Spielberg sent them all to like a proto boot camp for actors, and the actors like thought that it made them like real soldiers, and he thought that was like so ridiculous, and so he wanted to like sort of satirize that in Tropic Thunder. But I thought that like that's kind of funny in itself too, right? Because it's like, you know, you're making this film that's, you know, is like imperialist slop in a lot of ways, and like, you know, your kind of takeaway about it is that like the actors become sort of fascistic just by, you know, or whatever, like think of themselves as tougher guys than they actually are. Like there's something there about just the, again, this association with, you know, being powerful, and, you know, thinking also that like the playing make believe, I guess, that's associated with empire, right? Which is like kind of one of the things that's going on within this film. But anyways, it's just a minor comment. Charles, go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we keep returning also to this theme of like, you know, the admiration, you know, to put it lightly, that Jim has for Japan as like, you know, an imperial equal, or perhaps even superior, right, to his home country, you know, in a way that he doesn't even think of extending to China because of its position of subjugation, right? And you know, I think this is going to articulate as well with the point that you've been teasing, Tume, about you know, this convergence between liberal and fascist memory culture and aesthetics, and the way that really instantiates, I would say, in the historical memory of World War II, because, you know, that admiration isn't just like it's presented, you know, perhaps in some ways as coming from a childlike naivete, but it also is very indicative of like Japan's particular role as you know, a rising imperial power, basically, you know, starting from the Meiji Restoration of you know, 1868 or so, like a genuine colonial and imperial equal to the West, that it felt like it had to deal with on those terms, and whose rise, in fact, was in crucial ways assisted by Western powers. You know, there are many examples of this, right? You know, a lot of them, you know, concerning actually, like their joint, you know, subjugation of China, though not all by any means. You know, yeah, Japan joining hands with Western imperial powers in the Eight Nation Alliance that put down the Boxer Rebellion in 1900. You had, you know, an actual like bilateral alliance between Japan and Britain. Another very direct instantiation of that, you know, Jihyun tweet about white Japan. Yeah, the Tafkatsura Agreement of 1905, where the U.S. and Japan, secretly agreed to like mutually recognize each other's claims to Korea and the Philippines, respectively. Japan very opportunistically joining on the Allied side in World War One, so it could grab Germany's colonial possessions in Asia and the Pacific, most notably Shandong province in China. And then, in the aftermath of World War One, in the negotiations of the Treaty of Versailles, this really sort of dirty deal where Japan was not only trying to advance like a racial equality clause in the treaty, but they dropped that in return for the Western allies allowing them to keep Shandong rather than return it to China. That wound up becoming a major spur in the immediate term for the May 4th movement in China, which really like put the final nail in the coffin of like at least in that period, like attachment to Western like liberal ideals. Was a major spur to the development of Marxism and in China, and eventually the formation of the Communist Party. So, and then so that's some of the prehistory for it. But then even more concretely, in the immediate lead up to World War II, with both Japan's invasion of Manchuria in northeast China in 1931, and then its expanded invasion in 1937. The Western powers at best kind of criticize these moves rhetorically, but at the same time, really up until 1941, up until almost the eve of the Pearl Harbor attack, the U.S. was supplying like the overwhelming majority of a lot of the raw materials for continued Japanese industrialization and colonial expansion. I looked up some of the figures, like this is already years into Japan's like war on China, but the U.S. was supplying like 75% of Japan's scrap iron, 93% of its copper, and most notably over 80% of its oil. Right. So at a very deep material level, you had that history of inter-imperial collaboration and collusion, right, to try to divvy up China, perhaps in territorial terms, not as overtly as like the scramble for Africa, right? But where Japan was very much considered like a co-equal player, and one that the Western imperial powers had like, a lot of, in times, not even very grudging respect for, right? Really until Japan decided that the only viable strategy, right, was to actually for its continued colonial expansion was to actually initiate an inter-imperialist war against those same powers in the region. So, that is one major ingredient, I would say, of this humongous divergence between the Chinese and in more general terms, like kind of Asian popular memory of World War II versus that of like that's hegemonic in the Western allies today, right? This obviously was a major discursive sticking point for some time, but it reached a fever pitch with the 80th anniversary of Victory Day 2 months ago, and the discourse around the parade, because China's position is essentially that like it and other colonized Asian nations bore the overwhelming brunt of the sacrifices in defeating Japan, right? On the part of China alone, this was anywhere from 20 to 35 million lives. And throughout the war, even after, the entry of the U.S., or the kind of which was purely reactive, right? Purely reactive to Pearl Harbor. China was tying down anywhere from 60 to 80% of all of Imperial Japan's military as well, right? You have a similar story and a lot of parallels with the Eastern versus Western fronts of World War II in Europe as well. There's also the contention, which I think is quite valid, that World War II, if you're looking at it as a coherent whole, right, and as a global struggle against fascism, should probably be understood as beginning not with the German invasion of Poland in 1939, but actually with the Japanese invasion of Manchuria in 1931, right? Because China experienced that as a continuous 14-year war for national liberation, where like the Western powers, jumped in somewhat begrudgingly and not even like of their own accord for the last 4 years. There's also like an analytical distinction I think that China poses between what it calls the World Anti-Fascist War, which was fought and won by China, the USSR, colonized nations like Korea and Vietnam on their respective fronts, versus the other aspect of World War II, which really dominates the Western imaginary, namely the inter-imperialist war between the Western allies and the Axis, right? And this brings in as well that long sort of prehistory of collusion, between Japan, Nazi Germany, Italy to some degree, and Western imperial powers in the lead up to the war, as well as the post-war dispensation of the early Cold War, when what happened was both in Europe and in Asia, what the U.S. What the West, led by the U.S., did was it essentially, with the exception of some of the top leadership, right? It incorporated like the former fascist ruling classes of Japan and Germany into this new governing apparatus, right, as like sub-imperial partners of U.S. imperialism against the Soviet Union and China, respectively. In Japan, this was even more blatant because the U.S. basically decided to let the emperor Hirohito off the hook. They prosecuted a handful of the top war criminals at the Tokyo war crimes trials, but they gave like immunity to the head of Unit 731, which is this absolutely horrific human experimentation center in Northeast China run by Japan, on the condition that they basically transfer the results of their biological warfare research to the U.S., which they turned around and used immediately against Korean and Chinese people in the Korean War, right? And they literally like pardoned and released from prison and then elevated back into power, these really unrepentant Japanese war criminals because of their experience in, fighting communism, in fighting national liberation movements, so that Japan could really be cemented as like their forward base against Asian communism during the Cold War. And so, the analysis there is essentially that, both in that theater and in the European one, right, in a way that's really escalated during the war in Ukraine with this like whitewashing of Ukrainian fascism and its history of wartime collaboration with the Nazis, right? Its continued glorification of figures like Stepan Bandera. What you have in both of these major theaters of World War II is actually like a convergence of interests between the nominally liberal like inheritors of the victors of World War II on the Western side, and the ruling classes of the defeated parties because of their common interest in continuing to suppress revolutionary movements and suppressing communism and suppressing any efforts at genuine like self-determination by the global majority. And that this is the real reason why you had like a complete no-show, right? A complete boycott, essentially, by the modern day governments of the Western allies of World War II for what were arguably the two largest like anti-fascist commemorations of the year, which were precisely the Victory Day parades in Moscow this past May and in Beijing in September.
Love that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. Great. Yeah. I think the historical setup is really strong here. And thank you, Charles, for that, because and many people have written about this and it's to different times. I mean, you can go from George Jackson's analysis of fascism and where he talks about this Janus face, right? I know Gabriel Rockhill's doing work around that right now. I know that's like a big part of his work, and he has some presentations on that, you know. But then, you know, when you go to like Aimé Césaire and his idea of how fascism developed, and it was practiced in the colonies and things like that, right? And then it grew and it becomes fascism once it gets to its own people and so forth and so on. And I think that's important because what ends up happening, I think, and you watch this in the film when you see how Spielberg frames the Japanese, he really is attracted to like their sharpness and their formalism. So he's constantly showing like the shapes that they make in formations, right? And, you know, the reverence for like the Japanese sword, which in the 80s in the US becomes very, very popular, ninja films, right? The kind of like adept, like swiftness, and it's all vulgarized, and it's to me, it's quite nasty. And it's a deep attraction to it because they see a kind of like high elegance to it all, right? Even where they'll say maybe on some level it's fundamentally unsophisticated, right? Because it has like a primitiveness to it, right? Is what their assessment would be. It has nothing to do with, in many ways, how they treat people. It has to do with they're still dealing with a kind of like primitive idea of control. Really, what liberalism is always what? Soft power. Let's go to soft power, man. Like don't do that hard shit. Just do soft power. We'll be okay, right? It's literally the argument between Obama and Trump. It's just a soft power, hard power argument, not on anything else, right? They both agree on capitalism. But when you watch it, and then when you see the Americans, like I remember, you see like the shots of the planes of like the Japanese planes, and like they're very sharp, and they come in, and they don't have a lot of like emotional current, right? They're just like kind of in there. And there's a shot in the film where Jim is on top of the roof and he's seeing the American bombers coming, and he sees the Mustang. And I'm sure there probably was the predominant plane at the time, but the fact that it's a Mustang, and if we think about Mustangs and their kind of idea of like American hot rod sophistication, right? And you get to see the plane go, and you get to see the fucking cool American give him a wave, right? It's like this American kind of like next levelness of cool is like the final stage, and it's a bit more round, right? It's not as sharp, right? It's ordered, but it has a kind of fluidness, right? When you see the final soldier, right, he has this like rustic American thing, and he does it a lot in Saving Private Ryan. When you look at like, I think even casting someone like Tom Hanks and Matt Damon as like his heroes to kind of identify within the film, they have this kind of roundness to them. You know, I think, isn't Tom Hanks' character like a teacher in Saving Private Ryan? Right? I think he's like a professor.
I think so.
Right, he's like a teacher. Like the way he kind of thinks like the liberal kind of order exists is just at a higher stage because it has this like more humane roundness, and like the Japanese thing is just too rigid, but it's impressive because it can do so much and it can mobilize so much, but fundamentally it will never like really work. And the criticism is not baked on anything other than like, to me, like effectiveness. And to me, this is an implicit admission that they don't really have, or subconscious or political unconscious admission, they don't really have an issue with fascism outside of its effectiveness, right? That's really what the issue is to them. They'd be totally fine with it if they felt it was effective, right? And that just, what Charles brought out and all the other histories, it just stands up to history. You know, we could talk about the Smedley Butler stuff where they tried to overthrow the U.S. government here, right? And install a fascist government. Like there will always be people who are cool with it, right? And like to the final point is, right, and you see this in great films from like the 60s, in the 70s, in like Italy. Like they always have it where like the liberals are fine, but they have to kill the communists and the anarchists. Like the fascists in Italy, and they had to go and murder them. And Italian films like Investigation of a Citizen Beyond Suspicion, like they really show these things. Oh, one last thing, an interesting movie to watch in contrast to this that I also think they were very aware of was a film called Merry Christmas, Mr. Lawrence. It stars David Bowie as one of the stars and Ryuichi Sakamoto. It's a Japanese film, but it's made by Nagisa Oshima. And Oshima was a Marxist and a big anti-fascist. And it was one of his later films. And it's also based on a British novel, and it has to do with like a camp. But the film is interesting because if you know Oshima's politics, you can see what he's trying to kind of splinter into it. Is that Sakamoto's character, who is also like a Japanese commander of a camp, he has a psychosexual attraction to David Bowie's character. And he's literally showing that the fascist imperialist nature of the Japanese, right? There is a connection, right? And people miss it. And at the end, one of the final scenes with Takashi Kitano, they have like a chummy chat about this, of the inter-imperialist war. We're just kind of like, yeah, we kind of fucked up and made the world bad. He's like, these people are chummy, right? And if you know Oshima's he was a heavy Marxist. He was in the 68 stuff in Japan. He was part of Red, all that type of stuff. He was very much like, nah, this shit is whack, right? It's there. And that film is very well known. And I know Spielberg and them and Stoppard and them probably definitely watched, especially because David Bowie was in it, right? That's another film that I think you could watch in contrast and you could see the kind of bullshit of this one.
I appreciate it. I'm sure Charles has some other films that he can point folks to also. There's one more kind of scene kernel within the film that I just wanted to reference. I mean, like Mtume said, like there's so much. This film is about an hour longer than it needed to be to tell the story that it has, right? Like it is very, very drawn out. It has several scenes that are really not even necessary, right? Within the film. And I think this is part of, it's like Spielberg, like, I'm doing something artistic here. Like, watch me do it. I'm going to do it for the next 15 minutes. I'm going to do something artistic. So one of the funny things is there's this comment between Basie. He makes a joke to Jim at one point about, would you like a Hershey bar, right? And Jim being like, yeah. And he's like, well, I would too. Do you have one? And then at the end of the film, there's these scenes where they actually get aid, right? There's these ridiculous airdrops that are shown in the film where they drop basically like whole big metal refrigerated containers essentially from the sky. And I looked this up because it stood out to me that there were lucky strikes in the containers. And I mean, I don't know, I would have to do serious research to determine whether that actually occurred, but Google doesn't think that it did. Let's just put it that way. That, it's not, would have been highly unlikely but they did say that lucky strikes were heavily used within the US military and that they became, a form of currency for soldiers during the war and all of this. And so they were a part of the basic like MREs and like rations for US military soldiers as well. So that was a funny kind of moment where they drop all this stuff and you get all this like really shitty American like food, right? But it's funny, right? Because we look at it and think like, how ridiculous, like you're sending, Hershey's bars and Coca-Cola and evaporated milk and, cigarettes and all this stuff. And at the same time, like, I think that the film is trying to like, be like, look, all this great American shit is finally coming. Like, and that's sort of the response that Jim and the Americans that he knows sort of have to this, right? Basie says there's whole refrigerators dropping from the sky, right? Like we don't need to worry about food anymore and that kind of stuff. But the Hershey bar thing struck me in particular too, because like I don't, I'm sure you've both been to Europe at some point. Like I spent a semester in Ireland, and like American chocolate, nobody in the world thinks that American chocolate is good except for Americans. Like nobody is eating Hershey's anywhere else in the world. And there's no way that even living in, Shanghai, that like Jim wouldn't, he would want like Cadbury or something like that if he wanted, or maybe like Belgian chocolate or something like that. Right. Like, and so I just found that funny too, because it's like, it's very clear kind of like product placement, right? And like just American pushing their own kind of bullshit cultural products into this film in a way that would make people think like it's something that they want. And it's also kind of fits into, I mean, it might be like drawing a little bit too much out of it, but I think it's kind of this view too for Americans of understanding like we're the people who drop aid to the people who are like starving all over the world, right? And like these are the things that they want. They want our stuff, right? Instead, as opposed to like wanting to be able to have their own systems of agriculture, support their own communities rather than being disarticulated to serve US empire and stuff like that. So anyway, again, it's just like minor things within the film that bothered me a little bit, but one thing there. But yeah, I mean, I'm interested in the two of you have a better knowledge really about, other films that are more interesting on this period or this history or related histories that you would want to, point people towards, because we really don't want to recommend this film to people.
Yeah, I guess I can start off. That was a really interesting observation, Jay, about the aid airdrops and
Yeah, somebody else
how
mentioned spam too. That's the thing I forgot to mention. They also drop
spam.
spam
Yeah,
in, which is
literally.
like
Yeah, and how that too is like a vehicle for, or like this valorization of kind of you know a coming age of total US cultural hegemony, but also like it's apparatus of mass production of consumer goods, and in fact mass production of uh a consumer subjectivity as well, right? Which, as you mentioned, was something that it was trying to instill through its, and still is trying to instill through its like soft power apparatus in a way that actually fundamentally undermines like the the self-sufficiency and the sovereignty of nations around the world in terms of agriculture, in terms of food production, but also in terms of culture, right? And I'm gonna like do a like wild lateral segue here to our earlier discussion about how this was on paper like a Chinese US co-production of sorts, or at least that like the US studios like had like collaborators to facilitate the filming in China, and how that was a product of an era when like you know uh at least among sort of the like intelligentsia and more sort of elite educated circles and so on, there was an almost hegemonic um understanding in China, right? Or at least impression that the West, the US in particular, had a developmental model that was worthy of emulation, that China was like um backwards, right? In terms of material and cultural development vis-a-vis the West, and that there was this this unidirectional kind of path towards modernization that led basically into like full incorporation into a Western dominated like political, economic, and cultural order, right? And of course that is markedly different from the China of today, right? And I think there are a number of reasons for that, which are ultimately like we're Marxists here, right? They ultimately are downstream of political and economic like material factors. The big one being like, the rise of China as like an industrial and manufacturing sort of superpower, right? The fact that it did not content itself with, being like consigned to the bottom of the value chain, just this massive pool of cheap labor, but instead, today is like solidly outcompeting the U.S. in most of these domains, and that of course induces a degree of cultural confidence, right? That I would say was arguably not there in the 80s, right? In the environment that allowed for like the degree of Chinese participation, at least at the level of production, right? That we saw in Empire of the Sun. And that's a cultural confidence that Western observers, China watchers, and so on will often chalk up to a kind of like crude cultural chauvinism or nationalism, but I think that's really reductive, and it doesn't capture the way in which it specifically taps into a revalorization of China's history of internationalism and of resistance, right? Grounded ultimately in its socialist history, and the way that it, as well as the intensity now of Western, U.S.-led aggression on the military front, on the economic front, and on the propaganda front, has induced, as a counter-reaction within China, a revival of sort of popular anti-imperialist consciousness, which we see, for example, in the scale of cultural production, right, particularly online, in reaction to the Zionist genocide in Gaza, and the very strong affective identification that many ordinary people in China, a strong majority, I would say, right, feel with the Palestinian people, not just as victims, right, which is the only way in which they are legible as political subjects in much of Western political discourse, but as people resisting occupation and colonialism through armed struggle, right? This is something that I wrote about at length in an article last spring for Qiao Collective, the Gates of the Great Continent, right? This really strong identification, right, between Palestinian resistance fighters and the communist guerrillas that in most like non-urban settings really had an outsized role, like really punched above their weight in terms of numbers in the struggle against Japanese occupation, right? And so an outgrowth of that, right, in the cultural sphere is a lot more cultural production, especially in cinema, right, regarding the war of resistance against Japan. And I think there are a couple films there that are really worth counterposing to Empire of the Sun and to everything that it represented then in the 80s and continues to represent now, about like the limits, the myopic nature of Western memory culture surrounding World War II. There's one that made I guess a lot of news recently because it was released kind of in anticipation of the 80th anniversary of Victory Day. This is the film Dead to Rights, or in Chinese, Nanjing Zhaoxiang Guan, Nanjing Photo Studio, right, which is set amidst the Nanjing massacre. Highly recommend that people watch it when it becomes available for streaming. I don't think it's in theaters anymore. But yeah, beyond the fact that it is a Chinese production, that centers like I would say predominantly actually like forms of civilian resistance and steadfastness and survival, right? And sort of like continued sort of claims to national sovereignty in the midst of one of the single worst atrocities in human history. What's notable is in regards to the comparison with Empire of the Sun in particular, is that there are a couple brief appearances by like white characters, right? they are brief, as befits the fact that Westerners were largely bystanders to that actual like colonial war of aggression, as was the case like at a geopolitical level as well in 1937. But what's interesting is like the white characters they're not portrayed like wholly negatively, right? They're not like collaborating with Japan per se, but they limit themselves to very ineffectual appeals to international law and to their own sort of extraterritorial privileges whenever they witness or to some degree are subject to Japanese imperial atrocities, right? And that is kind of like a notable, I think, like undercurrent within that film. There's another one that I want to mention as well, which came out 5 years ago. It's called The 800, and that one is almost it's more of a direct counterpoint, I would say, to Empire of the Sun, because it takes place in the same city, Shanghai, and it's set like 4 years before the opening events of Empire of the Sun, when towards the tail end of the actual Battle of Shanghai, where Japan took over all of Shanghai outside the concessions. But what it centers on is this last stand battle that took place in the Sihang warehouse, and whose 88th anniversary actually was just a few days ago. But where the idea in propaganda terms was for this like ragtag group of several hundred, actually fewer than 800 remaining Chinese soldiers to defend this warehouse, not so much for its strategic value, but because it was right across the Suzhou River from the international settlement, right, from this British US concession. And the idea was to put on like a show of resistance against seemingly insuperable odds, at least for long enough to galvanize like a reaction, right, from Western powers, in such a way that they would meaningfully intervene. And of course that that in and of itself, that was not enough to trigger that change in policy from the West, right? It took a direct Japanese attack 4 years later. But I think what's interesting is that for most of the film, like there are repeated shifts, right, from the action scenes in the warehouse on one side of the river, right, where it's like the last bastion against the invading Japanese army, and then on the other side you see this like more or less untouched like mix of Chinese and sort of like Western built up infrastructure, as well as a mix of both Chinese civilians and foreign colonial nationals, right, mostly British and American, watching from the other side. And particularly like the white characters here, for most of the film, they treat it almost as like a spectator sport, right? They're kind of like observing dispassionately, and commenting with disdain on like how sort of like futile this last stand is, and how it can only hold out for a couple hours at most, right? They're literally like watching through their binoculars. They're watching from this like this blimp, this Goodyear blimp that's like passing overhead. And in material terms, like the colonial police in the concession on the other side of the river are cracking down on like civilian Chinese efforts to give any kind of material support to the Chinese troops on the other side of the river. So that I think is really interesting as a counterpoint to the direct representation of like one character's imperial subjectivity that we see in Empire of the Sun, where he too spends like a good amount of the film observing, at best dispassionately, right, and at worst like sort of actively supporting Japan out of his attachment to their image of like imperial grandeur, but showing the degree to which like in fact that kind of dispassionate air of like neutrality, right, was in some ways a generalized phenomenon among these settlers in the concessions, and not in fact at all materially decisive, but kind of illustrating very much in microcosm the ways that they stood on the sidelines, right, and did not materially intervene in this war of aggression until they became direct victims of it.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I broadly, I watch a lot of Chinese films, a lot of directors that I think that have been very, 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 very interesting, like for a long time, and doing like really, really great work. And I mean, Charles had brought up a film in our chat, a film called Saturday Fiction with Gong Li that came about 6 years ago. Historically, it's very interesting, but even formally, the way the story is told of the kind of the perceptions of reality, and it's really quite brilliant. The director's name is Lu Ye, and very, very, very great filmmaker. And he's another film that I think is actually a minor masterpiece in many ways. Like it's like I say minor because it's like slept on. It's like it's not meant to like be grandiose, but it's like this film you watch, you go, damn, it's just kind of dope. It's like super dope. It's called Purple Butterfly, and it's about Chinese resistance fighters being hunted by Japanese secret police. It's a really great film. It was made in like 2003 or 4, I think so. It's like the really, 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 really great stuff. And watch that to counteract, and you know, like Charles was saying, this stuff. And there's also just great films. I think one of the things that gets, at least from my watching, is that out of China there isn't like cinema that's happening that's like dialectical and doesn't have like a kind of robust. It's so far from the truth. This like really I find to be some of the most interesting cinema talking about civilizational development there is, period, that I've seen. Like Jia Shanga, like really, really interesting cinema, like really, and stuff that you could really dive into, you know, and watch. And yeah, I mean, avoid this movie, Empire of the Sun, at all costs. You don't need to. And you know, I'm so glad that Charles kind of also gave us everything the movie like chose to ignore. But also there are these films that you can begin to engage with, like this history made, you know, by Chinese people. And I'm always going to trust that source.
Yeah,
more than Spielberg.
Yeah, just to jump in on that last point, I think this is a really crucial observation about the way in which like Western cultural discourse like systematically flattens and reduces Chinese, like mainland Chinese cultural production, is that it like forces it into this really reductive framework of like, is it like a so-called like main melody state-backed propaganda piece, or is it a piece of dissident art, right? You know, individual directors, you know, creators, other cultural figures, you know, like Western critics try to force into that kind of dichotomy as well, in addition to their productions, right? And this is one where actually some of the directors that we've named like complicate that, right? Like Lo Ye, you know, he's produced some. He the director of Saturday Fiction. You know, he's made some stuff in the past that like, you know, in particular like Summer Palace, which is actually set during the 1989 Tiananmen events, right? Where like, you know, that gets like really feted by Western critics because it's like, oh, this like bold, you know, like a statement of artistic dissent against the regime, right? But then Saturday Fiction, as you mentioned, right, the film that I brought up in the chat, like, you know, it the main character, this actress played by Gong Li, actually, you know, it's mentioned at a number of points that she actually is an underground agent of the Communist Party, right? Who's trying to like deliver intelligence about, you know, the Pearl Harbor attack and the, you know, impending Japanese declaration of war on all these Western imperial powers, like in literally the days before it happens. And like that simple fact, right, is like illustrative of the fact that you are going to get a way more complete historical picture, right? Regardless of like, necessarily like the particular politics that the director has, or that are imputed to the director, right, by this really reductive Western narrative. Like, the fact not just of Chinese resistance to Japanese colonialism at a mass scale, but specifically of the role of communists even in like urban centers like Shanghai, right, as underground agents, right, is something that you only see like anything resembling like a fair depiction of in Chinese cinema. And another example that I could give, also set in Shanghai during the war, is this movie Hidden Blade, which stars Tony Leung and Wang Yibo. And it's more sort of in the espionage genre, right? Which is where, of course, like the Communist Party underground in Shanghai like really played an outsized role. But yeah, I highly recommend that as well. There's a ton of like longer form like dramas as well. It's a period of history that is sort of like rich with these kinds of stories. But this like reductive framework into which Western critics like force Chinese cultural production means that like I have a good comrade who used to be active in Qiao, who actually was like a Chinese national and went to film school in New York. And the point that he always makes is that curation is censorship, right? When it comes to the West, and the choice of what to elevate as like great art is like actually like a manifestly political calculation. And if you go just by like what is making the rounds on the Western festival circuit, right, or getting screened in like art house cinemas in the West, that is a very incomplete picture of Chinese cinema, and in particular like what you will like lose in narrative terms is this actual like wave of renewed like cultural appreciation for and pride, right, in that history of resistance, which appears not just in films and TV shows and so on about the war against Japan, but also recently, because of a number of historic 70th anniversaries, right? The Korean War, which in China is referred to as the war to aid Korea and resist U.S. aggression. And there you've had some major blockbusters, which I mean, honestly, in artistic terms, I have my gripes with them, but like, in terms of like the cultural splash that they made, right? Films like the Battle at Lake Changjin, as well as a ton of others by like Chen Kaige and so on, who himself, used to be feted in the West, much like Zhang Yimou, right? Much like this so-called fifth generation of Chinese filmmakers used to be feted in the West, because the movies that they made in the 90s were sort of compatible with like a basically liberal critique of the Mao period, right? But now that they're making these films that center on resistance to U.S. aggression, right, particularly in Korea, and that present like a direct rebuttal and refutation of the triumphalist narrative there, suddenly like Western critics decide that they've been turned into regime propagandists or something. And it's really pernicious. And if you don't really sort of go out of your way, I would say, to go outside the confines of what is curated by predominantly like liberal or left liberal like sort of cultural elites in the US in terms of like the Chinese cinema that they appreciate, then you're missing out on a lot.
No, thank you. Absolutely, Charles. I went there. I remember, as I had saw it was before I saw. I forgot why I watched Purple Butterfly, but I remember I got it, and I read the critics. They were, oh, this this film wants to be something. I'm reading all these Western critic things, and I'm like, okay, let me just watch this movie. About 30 minutes into, I'm riveted. I'm like, this movie is badass. And in the end, I was like, oh, this is some dope shit. And you're proving points that I've been saying 8,000 times, but with a much more specific analysis to the Chinese situation. So I appreciate that. I'm gonna clip this and send it to some people when they try to act like I don't know what the fuck I'm talking about.
Right on. If nothing else, you can help him Tume win his personal arguments against liberals.
Please.
Anytime. Yeah, just phone a friend. I got you.
At some point, I would actually like to have a much more robust discussion on this and the different kind of films that are coming out. This idea of the individual filmmaker that's lauded in the West, how that kind of situates itself. That actually is a very interesting question. I would not even put myself above what I have been curated to like to a certain degree and how I go into that. Though I can recognize certain things, like the fact that they love Summer Palace, and I saw it, I was like, oh, of course they love this. Right. I could beat that. But I would love to have a more robust discussion about that. That to me is very, very interesting.
Awesome. Couple things before we let you go, Charles. I mean, one, I don't know if any of you had any other final things. I think we've kind of covered the film and also a lot of alternatives. I try to capture as many things as you all referenced and put links, or in some cases, I think there was only one I found that I couldn't. It was the one you referenced that was more recent. Dead to Rights that I couldn't find a place that it was streaming yet, but the others are out there. Either in most cases you can get them for free, but in a couple you have to pay for them. But and I will go to starred stuff from the chat, but before I do that, Charles, just remind folks where they can find the work that you're involved in, and even I know you do some podcasting stuff yourself too, and that, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, most of my written work and the stuff that my comrades have produced as well, some really high quality translations, for example, of Chinese political analysis and commentary, can all be found at Qiao Collective. That's Qiao spelled Qiao. And then on our social media as well, in addition to my involvement with Qiao, we are part of this new coalition that is launched called Sovereign Media. It incorporates us, Venezuela Analysis, Orinoco Tribune, Black Agenda Report, a number of other really solid anti-imperialist media formations. And full disclosure, I actually work for them now, so you can see me in a number of the videos that they've been producing. That is content that is not on our website, but is on our Instagram, and our handle on all platforms is just Qiao Collective, QIAO Collective. Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, no, I was really excited with the launch of the Sovereign Media project. So I've been trying to repost and stuff like that when y'all have things that are out there. But it's a lot of great work and a lot of folks that I admire in various media spaces that are coming together, and I think that's awesome. All right, so chat stuff. So have you seen this film? Either of you Red Sorghum? I don't know if that came up in conversation. If it did, I missed it. But
yeah,
I've seen it
also, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I believe it was one of let me double check this.
It might be Yimou's first film.
I think it was Zhang Yimou's first film, actually, which is wild. yeah, it was as people point out, like literally from the same year as Empire of the Sun, but grounded in as people mentioned, like the both the like internal social contradictions of Chinese rural society, right? And the ways that like Japanese imperialism served as a structuring element for resistance. Really, really great movie.
If I remember correctly, I mean, the end of the film is the Chinese are resisting their aggression, led by Gong Li's character. If I remember correctly, it's been a little while since I've seen it, but that's kind of what I remember. I remember taking from the film, made in the same year.
Absolutely, yeah, highly recommend.
Christian Bale's character should have been slapped a little bit more in this. Yeah, definitely agree. There's like that's the other thing about this film. Like I think one of you said that there's not really. I think Mtume, you said this. There's not really characters that you like relate to, that's the thing I felt is like there's really nobody in it where you're like drawn to them as like some kind of like, oh, that's the person that I side with, or is like the kind of the voice of reason or whatever.
I just needed that scene for the driver to take a look at this, like, fuck all these people. I just wanted that scene, the driver to be like, man, please. Then I'd be like, that's my guy.
Yeah, I don't think he gets like any lines of dialogue, right?
He's just scared this is in the car.
Yeah, exactly. And there's like that actually reminds me of another thing that I noticed, which is that there are actually no intelligible lines of Chinese dialogue in any dialect until maybe like 30 or 40 minutes in. You hear like just like like the hubbub of the crowd or whatever, but
yeah,
it's
or
pretty much
bad
all
English,
and Japanese
right?
until
Like,
then. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, Jay here, I should say I haven't read any of Ballard's work, but he's brought up that like there's anti-blackness within his work as well, which like obviously is not surprising.
Science fiction, definitely not surprising.
Yeah. Empire of the Sun is a movie strategy of passively normalizing imperialism, and the audience for this movie are rich Americans to make them feel good about the normalization of imperialism. It was a movie released at Christmas time in theaters. That's one thing we didn't talk about too much. I mean, this was like supposed to be a big hit, and it wasn't. It was not a movie that was like a big blockbuster success. It did end up eventually making money because of one of the things that we've talked about with relation to a couple other movies of like it was able to be sold on the secondary sort of market to HBO and stuff like that for rights for a long time. And a lot of that kind of just rides in on the coattails of they probably wanted Spielberg's other movies, right, and had to make some kind of deal with Amblin or whatever else to get them, right? And so they just figured, oh well, we'll just throw it out there. It's Spielberg, people will watch it. But even interestingly with this, like I watched it on Pluto, which like again, I'm not encouraging anybody to use that platform or whatever, but I'm just saying I mention it because that's one of the like second, third tier free services where you get ads to watch these movies. And most of Spielberg's work at this point, is still kind of sought after within the streaming world where, Netflix or Prime or something like that, or HBO Max would be looking to, get it so that they could get people to watch these films. And a lot of it is even still available for like rental and stuff like that. Right. And so it's clearly recognized at this point as quite secondary within his overall, filmography.
That reminds me actually of another interesting wrinkle about the reception of this film, which is that it was made in the same year and it went head to head, in award season, like the Oscars and so on, with another like Chinese Western co-production, namely The Last Emperor. But that one is very different in political character, as people may know, because I think it was produced with probably a lot more like active input from the Chinese side, and it tells a story that actually fundamentally is all about is actually grounded in like Chinese history and the political subjectivity of the Chinese people, and in fact of the Chinese Revolution, right? Because it's based on the memoirs of the last emperor of the Qing dynasty, Puyi, who was forced to abdicate as like a small child, continued to live in some simulacrum of imperial extravagance, and was inculcated into totally sociopathic behavior like already in the imperial household, wound up trying to regain the throne through any number of sponsorships with warlords, with foreign powers, wound up settling on Japan as the one that he would throw his lot in with, right? Was installed by Japan as the puppet emperor of their like client state in Manchuria, and then wound up being captured by the communists, and then undergoing like really thoroughgoing and effective re-education and rehabilitation in a remarkably non-coercive way, so as to understand not just the error of his ways personally, but actually like the entire structure of feudalism and of imperial domination that he had spent his life perpetuating, and then ultimately coming out as like a genuinely convinced and repentant communist, and living out the rest of his days quite happily as like a private citizen. That was it was directed by Bernardo Bertolucci, right? Who yes, is a Western director, but a communist by political conviction. And there's some things about the movie that the fact that the dialogue is in English, right, that like take me out of it a little bit, but on the whole, politically, it's like and artistically, I think like quite superior, and I think just John, like even in the moment, right, even with how much Empire of the Sun does speak to the imperial ideological imperatives of the moment, the fact that it was thoroughly overshadowed by this other Western directed film shot on location in China, in fact in the Forbidden City, right? Like I think it illustrates that same phenomenon, Jay. Like
that's fascinating. Well, now we have to put that on the list because that wasn't there. Like that would be a good conversation to have at some point. For sure. All right. And I kind of memory hold that movie, but yeah, it was certainly, I have better memories of it than I did of this film. Yeah, I agree about chocolate, but spam is a different matter. I will say this: there was a lot of folks showing up for spam in the chat. Appreciated. I get it. I'm not here to yuck your yum. All right. Chocolate would be an example of Ali Kadri's waste, millions of acres of land exclusively in the tropics devoted to growing something nobody needs and can't use the land to grow in its stead. Absolutely. Yeah, I think this is a good point. People tend to give these movies and its creators like Spielberg far too much credit. It's not that sophisticated. It's literally just a way to make World War II vets feel good about their victory. I think there's a lot to that. And as I said in response to the chat, but I'll say it here as well. Like, I think there's a lot going on a kind of subconscious or even unconscious level within the creators of these films, right? So it's not necessarily that they're like creating very sophisticated propaganda designed to push certain things. It's like you got a contract with Coca-Cola, you live in empire, it's a story about white people in China, like you get to make China look, you get to make Japan look fascist, and that absolves you of your own, kind of history and liberalism or whatever. Like, so I think that there are fairly simple, oftentimes, kind of motivations behind a lot of this kind of stuff, but that doesn't mean, I guess, that it's less pernicious, right? Or that it doesn't, imbue a lot of, manage to get across a lot of imperialist messaging. And I think, to Mtume's point too, like having a big budget and being able to make stuff look like really good, like does a lot of the work for you. And so you could just be a shitty liberal with a really big budget and like you can do a lot of damage.
I also think, I mean, in that the final part of that statement says everything too. What do you have to then do to make World War II vets feel good about themselves? You have to lie about history, right? And you're gonna lie about history for 2.5 hours. You gotta like actively lie, and you have to actively do things. But also, movies do go through censorship boards in America. We just don't call them censorship boards. We just call them the marketing team.
Totally. I mean, yeah, capitalist censorship is all through like the corporate apparatus, if and there's state elements of it too, but yeah. I mean, yes, please like, share, subscribe. I forgot to plug it too. We do want to continue to plug the Imperial 80s Patreon because that's the one dedicated to this specific program. And we do put out bonus episodes like at least one a month. We've got 6 already on there. So we'd encourage people to support that as well. Definitely check out the Qiao Collective and the work that you all are doing there. Like, and I hope we can have. We need to have more conversations with you also on millennials too, Charles. There's a lot of stuff. People were very appreciative in the chat of all of the history and knowledge that you brought to this conversation. So much appreciated, man. Yeah. Either of you have anything else you want to say?
That's about it for me. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah.
This was a ton of fun, and definitely down to come back on.
Yeah,
absolutely.
And made those 2.5 hours worth it talking to you, Charles, about
yeah, exactly. No, it was worth it to hear everything that you had to offer,
Yeah.
for sure. I learned a lot today. All right, peace, everybody.